Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The silent call. It was just another regular morning, or so I thought. The bus was packed as usual, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and fresh rain from the street outside. I had my earbuds in, trying to block out the noise as I stared blankly out the window, lost in my thoughts. The city had a way of turning everything into a blur of gray buildings, gray sidewalks, gray skies. But then, just as I was about to close my eyes, something strange happened. The bus came to a sudden stop. At first, I thought it was just another traffic delay, but as I looked up, I realized we were no longer in the city. The streets had disappeared, replaced by a dense fog that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The usual hum of the city, the distant chatter, the honking of horns, everything had fallen silent. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. They were all buried in their phones or staring blankly ahead, completely unaware of the strange change in atmosphere. I hesitated for a moment, but then I noticed something. The driver, who had been silent since the stop, was now looking into the fog, his face pale. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, and I could see him muttering to himself, though his words were too soft to hear. "Excuse me," I called out, hoping to break the silence. "Are we stopping here?" The driver didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the fog, his lips moving in silent prayer. The atmosphere on the bus grew heavier, and I suddenly felt the oppressive weight of the air around me, as if something was closing in. I stood up, slowly, trying not to disturb anyone else. The bus was eerily still, as if the people aboard were trapped in a dream. The fog outside the windows thickened, rolling like a living thing, obscuring even the buildings just outside the glass. There was no sound except for the low hum of the bus's engine and the distant thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Something wasn't right. I moved toward the front of the bus, my steps slow and deliberate. When I reached the driver's seat, I saw him more clearly. His face was ashen, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring into the swirling mist ahead. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked again, my voice now shaky, uncertain. For a moment, there was no response. Then, his head snapped to the side, his eyes locking onto mine. He blinked rapidly, as if waking from a trance, and his lips parted. But instead of words, he let out a low, guttural sound, a noise that sent a chill straight through me. The bus suddenly jerked forward, and I stumbled back, grabbing the nearest seat to steady myself. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. The driver had no control over the wheel. The bus was moving on its own. I looked out the window, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The fog was moving too quickly now, almost as if it was chasing us, following us, closing in from all directions. The streetlights ahead, which should have illuminated the road, flickered weakly, casting twisted shadows that seemed to crawl along the ground. But there was no sign of life, no sign of any other vehicles, no pedestrians. Just the endless stretch of road, shrouded in that suffocating mist. The bus picked up speed, hurtling forward into the unknown. I turned back to the driver, but he was no longer looking at the road. His head was tilted back, and his mouth hung open, his eyes now glazed, like he was in some sort of trance. The low hum of the engine grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. Suddenly, the bus turned sharply, swerving off the road and into an area that I didn't recognize. The buildings were different, taller, older, like something out of a forgotten part of the city. The windows of the buildings were dark, and there was no movement, no sign of life anywhere. The bus slowed and then stopped again, but this time, the engine shut off with a sharp click. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. The fog had thickened even more, pressing against the bus windows like it was alive. I couldn't see anything beyond the glass, not even the street. And then, the whisper started. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was a voice, a soft, eerie voice, echoing from every direction, seeping into the very walls of the bus. Get off. The voice was unmistakable, clear and chilling. My eyes darted around the bus, but everyone remained still, as if they hadn't heard a thing. Get off. The whisper grew more insistent, almost urgent. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced at the door. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. I approached the exit, but as I reached for the handle, I noticed something strange. There was no handle. The door was sealed shut, as if it had never existed. Panic surged through me as I tried to pull it open, my fingers slipping against the cold metal. The whisper was now a scream echoing in my mind. Get off, now! I spun around, desperate for any other way out. The bus was alive, pulsing with energy, vibrating with a low, unnatural hum that shook my bones. The windows were fogging up from the inside, the condensation spreading like a creeping disease. I turned to the driver, but he was gone. His seat was empty. The steering wheel spun idly on its own, as if waiting for someone to take control. The bus doors didn't open. No one moved. There was no escape. I collapsed against the side of the bus, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything. But as I looked around one last time, I saw them. Figures. Shadows moving through the mist outside, their shapes flickering between the buildings. They were too still, too silent. Watching. Waiting. I heard the whisper again, louder than ever. Leave. But it was too late. The Mirror's Edge. I wasn't supposed to be here. The shop had been closed for years, yet here I was, standing at the entrance, staring at the old wooden door. The sign had long since faded, the glass cracked and dirty, but it was still there, tucked between two other buildings, almost hidden from view. The kind of place you'd walk by without giving a second glance. But today, for reasons I couldn't explain, I had stopped. The heavy wooden door creaked open as I pushed against it, and the scent of dust and forgotten memories hit me like a wall. Inside, the air was thick with the musty smell of old books and faded leather. The shop was small, the shelves packed with trinkets and oddities, each one more peculiar than the last. But what caught my eye was the large mirror at the far end of the room, framed in dark wood, its surface shimmering faintly despite the dim light. I had no intention of buying anything. I wasn't even sure why I'd come in, but something about the mirror called to me. I made my way toward it, drawn in by its strange allure. As I approached, I couldn't help but notice how unsettling the reflection was. The room behind me seemed darker, the shelves more cluttered, as if the mirror was distorting the space itself. But what really unsettled me was the figure standing just behind me in the reflection. It wasn't me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The shop was still empty, save for the dust-covered shelves and the thick silence that hung in the air. I stepped back toward the mirror, my breath shallow. The figure was still there, staring back at me with cold, emotionless eyes. It was tall, dressed in dark clothing, its face obscured by shadows. I reached out a hand, my fingers brushing against the cold surface of the glass. The reflection didn't move. My hand trembled as I pulled it back, but as I did, something strange happened. The reflection of my hand lingered even after I withdrew it. Slowly, the mirror began to distort, the edges of the glass rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. My stomach churned, and my mind screamed at me to leave, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted in place, entranced by what was happening before me. The figure in the reflection began to move. It stepped forward, its foot crossing into the frame, inch by inch. My heart raced as it continued to advance, its body coming closer to the glass. The reflection was no longer just a mirror of me, it was a doorway, a threshold between two worlds. A cold draft swept through the room, and I could see my breath in the air, but the figure didn't seem to notice. It was still coming toward me, slow and deliberate, its eyes fixed on mine. I took a step back, my hand reaching for the door, but the shop around me seemed to stretch, the walls growing longer, the shelves taller. I couldn't focus on anything except the reflection, which now dominated my every thought. The figure was just inches away from the glass, its hand reaching toward the surface, and I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. With a jolt, I snapped back to reality, my feet finally moving. I turned toward the door, but as I did, the figure in the reflection reached out and touched the glass, its fingers leaving behind dark, jagged streaks that seemed to move on their own. "Leave." The voice came from the mirror, and it was no longer the reflection of the figure speaking. It was mine. My own voice, distorted and hollow, echoing from the depths of the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away from the mirror. I had to get out. I didn't care about the price or the reason. I needed to leave before the mirror swallowed me whole. But just as I reached for the door handle, the glass shattered. Not in the usual way. The shards didn't fall to the floor. Instead, they hovered in midair, suspended by some unseen force. They swirled around me, spinning faster and faster, cutting through the air like knives. My breath caught in my throat as the mirror's surface disappeared entirely, leaving nothing but a gaping void where it had once stood. From within that void, the figure emerged. It was no longer just a reflection. It was real. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure's hand shot out, gripping my arm with an iron-tight hold, its fingers cold and unyielding. My body was dragged toward the shattered mirror, my feet sliding helplessly across the floor as I tried to break free. "Stay," it whispered, its voice the same as mine, twisted and distorted by the void. "Stay with me." I struggled, my heart racing, but the more I fought, the more it pulled. The darkness and the void seemed to pull me in, swallowing everything in its path. My feet lifted off the ground, and for a brief moment, I was suspended, hovering on the edge between two worlds. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back on the street outside the shop. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the pavement, and the world around me seemed as it always had. The shop was gone, the door locked, and the windows empty. There was no sign of the strange mirror or the figure. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was all a dream. But when I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushed against something cold and hard. I pulled it out, shards of broken glass. Pieces of the mirror. And in the glass, I saw my own reflection, except my eyes were empty, hollow. The last bus stop. It was past midnight when I missed my stop. The bus was unusually quiet, the soft hum of the engine the only sound that filled the air. I had been on my phone, scrolling through messages, and as I looked up, I realized the bus was almost empty. The few remaining passengers sat scattered around, staring out the windows or nodding off to sleep. I pressed the buzzer to alert the driver, but when the bus passed my stop, I felt a chill run down my spine. I stood up, ready to make my way to the front, but something was off. The driver wasn't paying attention. In fact, he wasn't moving at all. The wheel turned by itself, guiding the bus down the street. I thought I must be imagining things. After all, it was late, and my mind was tired. But the feeling of unease crept in slowly, settling deep in my chest. I glanced at the other passengers, but none of them seemed to notice. They were either asleep or lost in their own worlds, completely unaware of what was happening. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps too loud in the silence, until I reached the front. The driver's seat was empty. My breath hitched. The steering wheel still moved, but there was no one behind it. The bus kept going, picking up speed as if being pushed forward by some invisible force. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I tried to open the door, but the button was unresponsive, and when I looked out the window, the familiar cityscape was gone. Instead, the road stretched endlessly into the dark, with only the dim glow of street lamps to mark the way. The silence grew heavier, and I began to hear something in the distance, just at the edge of my hearing. It sounded like whispers, faint and unintelligible, drifting through the air like a haunting melody. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around. The passengers hadn't moved an inch, their faces pale and expressionless. But something about their stillness felt wrong, too still, like they were holding their breath, waiting for something. I grabbed the side of the seat, trying to steady myself. The bus began to slow down, but there was no sign of a stop. No sign of anything familiar. I pressed the buzzer again, but it was useless. The air inside the bus felt thick, suffocating. Then, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A figure. Standing at the back of the bus, shrouded in shadow. It wasn't moving, but it was watching me. I froze, not daring to blink, my mind racing for any explanation, but none came. The figure stepped forward, its feet barely making a sound against the floor. I couldn't make out its face, only a vague silhouette, tall and unnaturally thin. My body tensed, but I couldn't move. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, overlapping each other until it was impossible to ignore them. They weren't just voices. They were words. But they were words I could understand. My ears rang with their intensity, and I had to fight the urge to cover my head to block it out. "Leave," the whispers echoed. "Leave now." The figure reached the aisle and began walking toward me, its shadow stretching across the floor, consuming everything in its path. I tried to take a step back, but the aisle seemed to stretch infinitely, as if the bus had no end. I was moving, but it felt as if the distance only grew. The figure's hands were unnaturally long, its fingers twisting in strange directions. It reached out toward me, and I could feel the air grow colder, the temperature dropping with every inch it closed in. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow, and I instinctively backed away, but the figure followed. I had nowhere to run. The air felt thick with dread. The bus screeched to a halt, and I was thrown forward. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, but the figure was still there, its presence undeniable. "Get off," it hissed, the voice now unmistakably clear, not a whisper but a command. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, burning into me. I stumbled toward the door, my hand shaking as I tried to open it again. This time, it budged. I threw myself out of the bus, onto the cold pavement, and didn't look back. I ran. I ran without thinking, my breath sharp in the night air, my feet pounding against the hard ground. The city lights blurred around me, but the bus didn't follow. The eerie silence that had filled the air was gone, replaced by the usual sounds of the streets at night. I never saw that bus again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And I know now that I was lucky to have escaped. The Forgotten Room. It was supposed to be a simple move, just a change of scenery, a new apartment in the city to start fresh. I had never been in this building before, but it looked normal enough from the outside. Brick walls, old yet sturdy, with rows of windows that seemed like they belonged to another time. I didn't think twice when I walked into the lobby, received the keys from the landlord, and made my way upstairs. The apartment was on the 3rd floor, and as soon as I stepped inside, the stale air hit me. The place wasn't in the best condition, but it was livable. A bit of dust on the hardwood floors, peeling paint on the walls, but nothing I couldn't fix. There was one thing, however, that caught my attention immediately. A door. It wasn't marked, just a plain wooden door tucked away at the end of the hallway, almost hidden behind a clutter of old furniture and boxes. I didn't remember seeing it on the floor plan when I toured the apartment, but there it was, standing there, slightly ajar. At first, I thought it was a closet or storage room, but when I tried to push it open, it felt heavier than I expected. I was still new to the place, still settling in, so I told myself it was nothing to worry about. Still, the door nagged at me. I continued unpacking, trying to ignore it, but something about it kept drawing my attention. It was as though the door was calling to me, pulling at my curiosity. As night fell, I could hear strange sounds coming from behind it. Soft creaks, the sound of something shifting. I tried to convince myself it was the building settling, the usual noises of an old structure. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The noise continued, faint whispers, like someone was in the room just behind the door. I kept tossing and turning, my thoughts running wild. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up from the bed, heart pounding, and walked toward the door. I placed my hand on the knob, and for a moment, I hesitated. But I turned it anyway. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing an empty room. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The room was small, about the size of a walk-in closet, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the space. The walls were bare, and there was nothing inside except dust and cobwebs. But then, I noticed something odd. The walls, there were marks on them. Scratches, as if something had been clawing at the paint. And in the far corner, an old chair sat, its back turned toward me. I stepped into the room, my footsteps barely audible on the creaky floor. The air felt cold here, colder than the rest of the apartment. I reached out to touch the chair, my fingers brushing against its back. Just as I did, the light bulb flickered, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching toward me. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing. The whispers started again, only this time, they were louder. Clearer. They sounded like voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. The air grew thicker, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the entire room shake. I spun around, my breath quickening, and tried to turn the knob. It was locked. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging me to leave, but I couldn't. I pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but no one came. The chair in the corner began to rock, slowly at first, then faster, as if someone invisible was sitting in it, swaying back and forth. Then, the air grew heavier, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I froze, my skin crawling. Something was behind me. I turned slowly, but no one was there. The chair was still rocking, but there was no sound except for the whispers, now so loud they felt like they were inside my head. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't think. In a panic, I ran to the far corner of the room, trying to find an escape, but the walls were closer now, pressing in on me, the air suffocating. I felt the room closing in, the walls closing around me, the whispers becoming a roar. It felt like the room itself was alive, and it was trying to consume me. I hit the door again, and this time it gave way. The door burst open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. The apartment was silent again, the normal hum of the city outside filtering through the walls. The room behind me was empty, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't return to that room. I never even opened the door again. The next morning, I packed my things and left, moving into a different apartment on the other side of the city. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those whispers, faint and distant, coming from somewhere in the walls. The room was still there, I'm sure of it. Waiting. The old theater. The old theater had been closed for years, a forgotten relic tucked away in a corner of the city. I had heard stories about it, how it had once been the center of the town's entertainment, how people would line up for tickets to sold-out performances. But now, it was nothing but a dark, decaying building. I wasn't planning on visiting it at first. I had simply been passing by, on my way home from the bookstore. But something drew me to it. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned. It seemed strange that such an old building still had lights on, especially so late at night. Without thinking, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, stale air, mildew, and the unmistakable scent of dust. The lobby was vast, with faded velvet chairs stacked against the walls, and old posters of long-forgotten plays hanging crookedly. I didn't know what made me keep going, but something about the place felt alive, like it had a story to tell, even though it was decaying. I wandered deeper into the theater, past the concession stand that still had remnants of old candy wrappers on the counter. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnervingly through the hollow space. As I passed the hallway leading to the main auditorium, I noticed a faint light flickering at the end of it. My curiosity got the best of me, and I walked toward it. The hallway stretched on, seemingly endless, until I reached a pair of double doors. They were half open, just like the front door. I pushed them open, the sound of the old hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the theater sat in eerie silence. The once lavish red velvet seats were now tattered and covered in dust. The stage was empty, but the faint outline of a spotlight could still be seen, shining on the worn wooden floor. I stood in the back for a moment, taking it all in. Everything about this place was a strange blend of nostalgia and decay. It was as if time had stopped here. Then, the air shifted. The room seemed to grow colder, the atmosphere heavier. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. My heart began to race for no reason. I felt like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me from the shadows. The light flickered again, and I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the empty rows of seats and the empty stage. I told myself it was nothing, just the imagination playing tricks in the dim light. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. A faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It was a voice. Come closer. My breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, like it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but the theater was still empty. The air was thick with tension, and my heart raced faster, faster than it ever had before. I backed away toward the door, but as I took a step, the light in the room suddenly snapped on, blinding me. I raised my arm instinctively to shield my eyes. But when the light cleared, I froze. The stage was no longer empty. A figure stood there, draped in shadows, its face hidden in the dark. It was standing completely still, as if waiting for me. I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen, my mind refusing to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure didn't move or speak, but I could feel its gaze on me. The whispers grew louder, but this time I could make out words. Leave or stay. I didn't know what it meant. All I knew was that I had to leave. I turned and ran for the door. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, but I didn't dare look back. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more urgent. I reached the hallway and stumbled toward the front doors, but the building seemed to stretch longer with every step I took. When I finally reached the lobby, I burst through the door and into the night air, gasping for breath. I glanced back once more at the theater. The door was still slightly ajar, but the faint light that had drawn me in was now gone. The building was completely dark, its windows like empty eyes staring out at me. I never went back to the theater. I couldn't. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but I know it was real. And I'm sure that the theater is waiting for someone else to answer its call. The abandoned diner. It was late, almost midnight, when I drove down the road and saw it, a neon sign flickering erratically that read the Sunrise Diner. The place looked like it had been closed for years, the sign rusted, the windows covered in grime. I was exhausted after a long drive and, though I knew I should have kept going, something made me pull over and park. I hadn't planned to stop. I wasn't hungry, and I had no interest in old diners. But there was something about the place that made me feel drawn to it, like it had a story to tell. The lights flickered, casting an eerie glow across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin, and walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. The hinges squeaked as I pushed it open, the scent of stale coffee and old grease hitting me as I stepped inside. The diner was dark, with only the faint glow of neon illuminating the room. The counter was long and empty, the stools piled up on top of it. The floor was speckled with dust, and the booths, though they still had their red upholstery, were torn and faded. It looked like no one had been here in years. I figured it was abandoned, but as I walked further in, I felt something wasn't right. The air felt thick, heavy, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something. A faint hum of the old jukebox in the corner played a song on repeat. It was an old tune, from the 50s, and I could swear I heard a voice singing along. But when I looked at the jukebox, it wasn't playing. I moved deeper into the diner, my footsteps echoing on the tile. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a sense of being watched creeping over me. I knew I should leave, but something held me there. The sound of silverware clinking, a soft whisper of voices. I froze. I turned around quickly, but the diner was still empty. The voices were gone, leaving behind only the hollow echo of my own breath. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A shadow in one of the booths. It was small, barely visible in the low light, but it was unmistakable. I approached cautiously, each step slow and deliberate, my heart thudding in my chest. As I drew closer, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was a shape, a dark silhouette, sitting motionless at the booth. My stomach churned. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No response. I moved closer still, until I was almost right next to the booth. The figure didn't move. But then, just as I was about to reach out, its head snapped up. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The face, if it could even be called a face, was wrong. It was a blur, like the features were melting or shifting, flickering in and out of existence. The eyes were wide, hollow, black voids that stared at me with a vacant emptiness that made my blood run cold. "Leave," the voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill through me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the floor, desperate to reach the door. But the diner seemed to stretch, the hallway lengthening, as if the building itself was trying to keep me there. The jukebox played louder now, the same song on a loop, and the voices, the whispers, returned. They were everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in. I reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. I yanked at the handle, my hands slick with sweat. The voices behind me grew louder, more frantic, and the temperature in the room dropped, a freezing cold seeping into my bones. I looked over my shoulder, just for a second, and saw the figure in the booth, standing now, its arms outstretched, as if reaching for me. "Leave this place," the voice growled, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I screamed, pulling at the door with all my strength. Finally, it gave way, and I stumbled outside, gasping for breath. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. The diner, with its flickering neon sign, faded into the distance, but I could still hear the song in my head. The voice. The eyes. And the feeling that something had been waiting for me. The Forgotten Station. It was a crisp autumn evening when I found myself walking through the woods, hoping for some fresh air to clear my head after a long day. I had stumbled across an old train track by accident. At first, it seemed harmless, just a rusty, forgotten line cutting through the forest. But as I walked along the overgrown tracks, the world around me grew quieter, the sounds of the forest fading away, replaced by a strange stillness. As I walked deeper into the trees, I noticed something unusual up ahead, an old, dilapidated train station, half hidden by the thick brush. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong in the woods at all. The wooden platform was rotting, covered in moss, and the station sign, though faded, still read Maplewood Station. I stood there for a moment, puzzled. The place was clearly abandoned. There were no trains here for years, the windows were shattered, and the ticket booth was long empty. But something about it piqued my curiosity. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to step inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The station's interior was dark, with only a few dim lights flickering overhead. I took a few cautious steps inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decaying wood. The walls were covered in peeling posters of long-forgotten events, old train schedules, advertisements for local events, and advertisements for long-dead businesses. It felt like a time capsule, frozen in the past. And yet, there was something unsettling about the place. The silence was oppressive, and it seemed like the whole building was holding its breath. As I explored further, I noticed an old map of the train routes on the wall, but there was something strange about it. One of the lines on the map was marked in red, a route I didn't recognize, leading to nowhere. I glanced down at my watch. Almost an hour had passed since I first entered. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I needed to get back home. I headed toward the exit, but as I reached the door, I froze. I heard something. A sound, faint but distinct. It was a whistle. A train whistle. I turned around, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything, but the whistle was unmistakable. It sounded distant, almost as if a train were on its way. But no trains had run through this station for years. I looked around again, my pulse racing. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the platform, a figure appeared, standing still, just watching me. At first, I thought it was another visitor, someone else who had wandered in like me, but then I noticed something off. The figure was pale, almost translucent, like a ghost. It was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, the kind people used to wear a century ago. Its face was obscured by a large, old-fashioned cap, and it didn't move a muscle. The sound of the whistle grew louder, the train drawing nearer, but I couldn't hear the wheels. It was as if the train wasn't really there, but I could feel it. The air in the station grew heavy, and the lights flickered violently. The figure started moving toward me, slowly, deliberately. My heart thudded in my chest, and panic started to claw at me. I stepped back, toward the exit, but before I could reach the door, the figure's voice broke the silence. It was quiet at first, just a whisper, but I could make out the words. "Leave, or you'll be trapped like us." I froze. My legs went weak, my mind spinning with fear. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The lights overhead buzzed louder, the whistle now deafening. Then, something even stranger happened. The walls of the station seemed to distort, warping around me, like the entire building was stretching and shrinking at once. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed it, the train. It had arrived, though I couldn't see it. But the station was no longer empty. There were people, standing along the tracks, all wearing old clothes and staring blankly ahead. They didn't move, didn't blink. They were just there. Frozen. The ghostly figure stepped closer, its face still hidden. "The train is waiting for you," it said in a low voice, almost like a command. My body finally obeyed, and I bolted for the door. I had no idea how I managed to escape, but I ran, not looking back until I reached the edge of the woods. The station was far behind me, the train whistle now just a distant memory. I've never gone back to that place. And sometimes, when I'm walking through the woods, I still hear the faint sound of the whistle, drifting on the wind, as if the station is still calling me, waiting for me to return. But I know better now. Some places are meant to be forgotten. The Silent Highway. It was a typical Friday evening when I decided to take the long route home, hoping to clear my head after a stressful week. The sun had already set, and the highway stretched out before me in complete darkness. I usually preferred the quiet roads over the hustle and bustle of city life, and tonight it was especially peaceful. I was on a road I didn't usually take, an isolated stretch of highway that cut through a dense forest. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly midnight. As I drove, I began to notice something strange. There were no other cars. The highway, which normally had at least a few trucks or cars passing through, was completely deserted. I figured maybe it was just a quiet night, but the further I went, the more unnerving it became. There were no other headlights in sight, no distant sounds of engines in the background, just an eerie, hollow silence. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the trees seemed unnaturally thick, closing in on either side of me. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease that had settled in my chest. Something about the night felt off, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Suddenly, the car's radio flickered to life, static filling the cabin. I glanced at the dial. The station was completely random, some old-timey channel with a faint, crackling voice that I couldn't make out. It didn't seem to be a broadcast, more like a recording playing by itself. I tried turning the volume down, but the static only grew louder until it became a loud, unbearable screech. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, my pulse racing. I quickly slammed the off button, but the noise continued. I fumbled for the power button, finally managing to silence the radio. I was starting to feel a strange pressure in the air, like the atmosphere itself had thickened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It's just a malfunction, I thought. But that didn't explain the silence outside. Just as I was about to take a turn onto another stretch of road, the car slowed, almost as if it had lost power. I pressed the accelerator, but it didn't respond as it should. The car sputtered and lurched, forcing me to pull over to the side of the highway. My headlights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving me in pitch darkness. I sat there in the complete stillness of the night, my breath quickening. I tried starting the engine again, but nothing happened. I was stranded. I got out of the car, heart hammering, and looked around. The trees around me loomed dark and silent. There was no sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. The highway seemed to go on forever in both directions, an endless, empty stretch. I pulled my phone from my pocket to call for help, but the signal was gone. The screen flickered, the usual bars of service were replaced by a single, then nothing. I tried dialing anyway, but the call wouldn't go through. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a light. Just a tiny glimmer at first, as if a car's headlights were approaching from far down the road. I squinted, trying to make out the details. The light grew closer, but it wasn't a car. The light seemed to hover, suspended, moving along the road. It was strange, like the light was detached from any source. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. My instinct screamed at me to stay in the car, but I couldn't tear myself away. I began walking toward it, my steps slow and hesitant, each one heavier than the last. As I drew closer, I realized it wasn't a light at all. It was a figure, a tall, slender silhouette, standing motionless in the middle of the road. The figure had no clear form, just an outline of light that pulsed in rhythm with the eerie silence. I stopped dead in my tracks, my throat tightening. The air grew cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I could feel its presence, pressing down on me. It was as if it was waiting for something I couldn't understand. And then, the whispering started. Low, muffled voices that I couldn't place. They seemed to come from all around me, like the forest itself was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. The more I listened, the more the voices seemed to grow louder, all converging into one unified sound. It was overwhelming, like the forest was trying to communicate with me. Without thinking, I turned and ran back to the car. My heart pounded as I threw open the door, slammed it shut, and tried the engine again. This time, it roared to life, and the headlights flickered back on. I wasted no time, slamming the car into drive and speeding off down the highway, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. By then, the night had become calm again, almost peaceful. But the memory of that road, of the figure, of the voices, those things stayed with me, haunting me long after I had left that highway behind. I never drive that stretch of road again, and I always check the lights before I leave. The Forgotten Corridor. It was an ordinary afternoon when I decided to visit the old library in the city center. I'd heard about it before, an ancient building tucked between newer office buildings. The library wasn't known for being particularly popular, but it had this charm, this antique feel that I couldn't resist exploring. The air inside was musty, like old books and dust had combined over the years to form an atmosphere that felt both calming and oppressive. There were rows and rows of shelves, and though the space was large, it was strangely quiet, too quiet for a public library. The only sound was the occasional shuffle of pages as I passed through the aisles. I wandered deeper into the building, marveling at the ancient texts lining the shelves. The place was filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. It was like stepping back in time, but in a way that didn't feel entirely safe. After a while, I stumbled across a narrow corridor that I hadn't noticed before, a hallway tucked behind a row of towering shelves. It didn't look like it led anywhere important, and yet I felt a strange pull to go down it. The corridor was dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting shadows along the walls. There was no sign to indicate what lay ahead, and no one else seemed to be walking down it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped forward, my footsteps echoing against the cold stone floor. The air was thick here, stifling, and the walls seemed to close in on me the further I went. My heart started to race, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and leave. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were no windows. No natural light, only the faint yellowish glow from the overhead lights. The hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, twisting and bending in ways that didn't seem physically possible. The walls were lined with old portraits of people I didn't recognize, their eyes strangely lifelike, following me as I walked past. I began to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound I could hear, but a presence, like someone was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I slowed my pace, unsure of whether I should continue. As I rounded a corner, the corridor opened up into a small room. It was nothing spectacular, just a dusty, forgotten space with a single wooden chair and a stack of old books in the corner. But there was something unsettling about it. The room felt like it hadn't been touched in years, yet the chair was perfectly positioned, as if someone had just left it there moments ago. I approached cautiously, my footsteps hesitant on the stone floor. The room seemed to grow colder, and I shivered involuntarily. As I neared the stack of books, I noticed a journal resting on top. It was leather-bound, old, and looked like it had been recently placed there, even though everything around it appeared to be abandoned. I reached for the journal, my hands trembling. As I flipped it open, The pages were filled with writing in a hurried, messy hand. At first, the words made no sense, scribbles, names, dates, but then one phrase stood out. They are watching. I can hear them. My blood ran cold. The handwriting was erratic, as if the person who wrote it had been under some kind of distress. I turned the page, and the next one was worse. The walls are moving. I don't know how to escape. They know I'm here. The feeling of being watched intensified. I quickly closed the journal and looked around, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in on me. The room felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, a heavy pressure hanging in the air. Without thinking, I turned and bolted from the room, rushing down the corridor. But the way out wasn't where it had been. The hallway stretched longer, and the turns didn't match the way I had come. It was as if the entire library was shifting, rearranging itself to trap me inside. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing seemed familiar. The paintings on the walls, those same lifelike eyes, were now staring at me, following me with a terrifying intensity. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I was no longer sure if I was alone in the library, or if I was trapped in something far worse. I started to run, but no matter how many doors I opened, I couldn't escape. The same narrow corridor, the same room with the chair, and the journal, it was all looping. I couldn't find the exit, and the walls seemed to whisper in a language I couldn't understand. I don't know how long I wandered those corridors, but at some point, the library itself seemed to reject me. I felt a jolt of energy, like a cold hand pushing me out. The next thing I knew, I was standing at the front doors of the library, gasping for air. I don't know how I made it out, but I never went back. And when I passed by the library weeks later, it was closed for renovation. I don't think it will. The Forgotten Photograph. I was staying in a small, rented cabin by the lake. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway, away from the noise of the city. I had rented this cabin once before, years ago, and the memories of that trip were a pleasant blur. So, when I needed a break from work, I thought it would be the perfect place to unwind. The cabin itself was quaint, with wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking the dark water. The air was fresh, and there was an unsettling stillness that felt almost calming. No one lived in the nearby houses. The area was isolated, making it a perfect retreat for those looking to escape. The first day passed quietly. I spent most of my time by the water, reading and enjoying the solitude. As night fell, I noticed that the lake seemed unusually quiet. No fish jumping, no sounds of wildlife, just the gentle ripple of water as it lapped against the shore. But what caught my attention was something on the far side of the lake. In the dim light, I thought I saw movement, a faint silhouette at the edge of the trees. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me. On the second evening, I decided to venture into the small attic of the cabin. It was filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, forgotten relics from past tenants. As I explored, I came across a small, old cardboard box in the corner, half hidden behind an old chair. It looked out of place. When I opened it, I found a stack of photographs, old, yellowed with age. Most of them were blurry, faded, or damaged, but one in particular caught my eye. It was a photograph of the cabin, taken from a distance. But there was something off about it. The cabin looked newer, almost as if it had been taken years before it was built. The trees around it were thick and overgrown, and in the background there was a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, standing in the distance. It was hard to make out the face, but the posture was unmistakable. The figure seemed to be staring directly at the camera, though there was no one around at the time the picture was taken. I turned the photo over, but there was no date, no explanation, just the smudged remnants of a name that I couldn't read. A chill ran down my spine as I studied the photo. It was unsettling, but I couldn't stop staring at the figure. I set it down and began flipping through the rest of the photos, hoping to find something that made sense. But all I found were more strange images, dark, empty rooms in the cabin, strange shapes in the windows, shadows in places they shouldn't have been. I wasn't sure whether I was imagining things or if the photos were somehow wrong. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts racing, and the unease grew. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, like someone walking around the cabin, but when I checked, there was no one there. The wind rustled the trees, but that didn't explain the feeling that something, or someone, was just beyond my sight. The next day, I decided to go back down to the water, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. As I walked along the shore, I glanced toward the far side of the lake. There, at the edge of the forest, was the figure from the photograph. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I blinked, it was still there, standing motionless, staring in my direction. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The figure was unnaturally tall, its outline dark against the light of the trees behind it. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. Then, as if it had been waiting for me to notice, it began to move toward the lake, its steps slow and deliberate. I could feel my pulse quickening as it drew closer. I didn't know what to do, whether to confront it, scream, or flee. But before I could decide, the figure stopped, just short of the water. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, its gaze fixed on me. The moment stretched into something unbearable, the air growing thick, the silence deafening. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin, but somehow, I found myself inside, locked in the silence of the walls. I was sweating, shaking, and my mind was racing. I knew I had to leave, now, but something kept me there, as if the cabin itself was holding me in place. That night, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care to stick around any longer. As I was about to leave, I glanced at the photo again. I froze. The figure from the photograph was no longer standing in the distance. It was closer now, right at the edge of the porch, its face barely visible in the shadows. I dropped the photo, ran to my car, and drove away, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I haven't returned to that cabin, and I'm not sure if I ever will. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. The radio's last broadcast. It was a quiet evening, and I was cleaning out the attic in my childhood home. I had been living in the city for years, but after my parents' passing, I felt compelled to return and sort through the remnants of their life. It was an old house, a creaky, two-story structure with narrow hallways and a distinct smell of old wood. The attic, with its low ceiling and dim lighting, had always felt like a strange place to me growing up. I never spent much time up there. As I rummaged through boxes of forgotten belongings, old family photos, a few antique furniture pieces, some dusty childhood toys, I came across something unusual, an old radio. It was a vintage piece, dark wood with brass details, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. I recognized it immediately. It had been my father's. I remember him spending hours fiddling with it, listening to obscure stations. He always said there was something special about that radio, that it had a way of connecting to voices from the past. Of course, I thought it was all nonsense back then, but I decided to plug it in and see if it still worked. The sound crackled to life, filling the room with static at first. I fiddled with the tuning knob, trying to find something clear. After a few minutes, I managed to find a station. It was faint, but I could hear the host speaking in an almost urgent tone. "The end is near," the voice said. "We don't have much time. The signal is starting to fail. You need to." The broadcast cut out suddenly, replaced by a harsh buzzing noise. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't know why. It was just a glitch, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. I adjusted the dial again, hoping to find something else, but this time, when the static cleared, I could hear a different voice. A woman's voice, soft and unsettling. "Please, if you're hearing this, you need to leave the house now. They're coming. You won't be safe much longer." My heart skipped a beat. Who was this? How was she speaking to me through a radio in my father's old attic? The voice was trembling, as though she was barely holding it together. "Who is this?" I whispered aloud, as if she could hear me. There was no answer, only a loud screech of static. The radio flickered, the signal cutting in and out erratically. I grabbed the radio, intending to turn it off, but before I could, the voice returned. This time, it was much clearer, as if she were standing right next to me. "You don't understand," she said, the words tinged with panic. "The house, it's not just a house. It's a beacon. A place where time, reality, they don't work the way you think. The past and future overlap here. You've seen things. The shadows you've seen in the corners of your vision, they aren't just memories. They're projections. Fragments of what was, and what's yet to come." I stood frozen, holding the radio tightly. A rush of cold air swept through the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice trembling now. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the radio let out one final burst of static, louder this time, followed by a low, mechanical hum. The hum felt like it was vibrating in my bones. Then, as quickly as it had come, the radio fell silent. I stood there, staring at it, heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. I didn't know whether to turn it off or leave the attic immediately. But something kept me rooted in place, a nagging feeling that there was more to the message, that there was something I needed to understand. I walked to the window and looked out into the backyard. The night was eerily still, and the trees in the yard stood like silent sentinels against the darkness. For a moment, everything seemed too quiet, too unnatural. I turned back to the radio, unsure of what I was about to do, but I knew I had to try again. This time, when I tuned the dial, there was only more static. And then, just as I was about to turn it off, I heard something faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice. "Don't open the door," the voice whispered. I froze, my hand still on the dial. I hadn't heard anyone outside, but something about the voice felt urgent. I didn't know what door it was referring to, but the air around me seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating. Without thinking, I rushed downstairs, and to my horror, I found that the front door was wide open. The cold night air rushed into the hallway, and I could feel a strange pressure pushing against my chest. The radio's words echoed in my mind, "Don't open the door." But I couldn't understand why it was open. I was certain I had locked it when I came upstairs. I could hear something moving outside, faint footsteps in the gravel. In a panic, I slammed the door shut and locked it again, my mind racing. The whispers on the radio, the strange feeling that something was wrong, all of it was becoming too much to process. I wanted to leave, to get away from this house, but something kept me inside, as if the place had a grip on me, refusing to let go. As I moved away from the door, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the hallway mirror, a shadow, tall and dark, standing behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air was thick with the weight of it all, the pressure building again. My chest felt tight, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The shadow in the mirror was still there, I could feel it. And the whispers returned, louder this time. "You're not alone," they said. I turned and fled out the back door, my heart hammering in my chest. The air outside felt colder, but there was no trace of anyone there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to return. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the next night either. And when I finally left, I didn't look back. The creaking floorboards. I had just moved into an old townhouse in the city. It wasn't the most glamorous of places, but it was affordable and, most importantly, quiet. After years of apartment living, I was desperate for some space, even if the townhouse was older than anything I'd been used to. The floorboards creaked with every step I took, and the walls were thin, every sound from the street seemed to seep through. Still, it was mine, and I was excited to start fresh. The first few days were uneventful, with me unpacking boxes and settling into my new routine. But on the fourth night, something happened. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint noise, a creaking sound. I paused and listened. It came from the hallway, just outside my bedroom door. I couldn't tell if it was the house settling or something else. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I chalked it up to old pipes or some other natural house noise. But then it happened again. The creak, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of feet. I felt my heart rate quicken. I got up and opened the bedroom door, but there was nothing there, no one in the hallway, no indication that anything was out of place. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to think. My mind raced, trying to convince myself it was just the house. It had to be. After all, this place was decades old, and old houses had their quirks. The next night, the creaking returned. It wasn't just the floorboards anymore. I could hear a faint scratching sound, as if something, or someone, was gently dragging itself across the floor. I froze, my pulse quickening. It wasn't the house settling this time. It was too precise, too intentional. I crept out of bed and moved to the hallway, holding my breath. The noise seemed to be coming from the attic, a small, dark space at the top of the stairs. I knew I had heard it earlier in the day when I was exploring the house, but I hadn't dared to go up there yet. I had noticed the attic door was old, warped, with a rusty latch that seemed to stick when I tried to open it. But now, that scratching sound was unbearable, and my curiosity took hold of me. I had to know what was causing it. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and ascended the stairs to the attic door. The hallway was dimly lit, but the soft light of the flashlight illuminated the peeling wallpaper and chipped paint on the door. I hesitated for a moment, but then I slowly reached for the latch. The door creaked open with an eerie groan. The flashlight beam revealed a dusty, forgotten space, old trunks, broken furniture, and piles of old clothes. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, nothing that could explain the noises. But then I noticed something odd. At the far end of the attic, there was a small, framed mirror propped against the wall. I don't remember seeing it there earlier when I explored. In fact, I could have sworn the attic was completely empty when I first checked. I approached the mirror cautiously, the faint scratching noises still echoing around me. My breath was shallow as I stared into the reflection, half expecting to see something move behind me. But nothing happened. For a moment, I thought it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired, or perhaps my mind had started playing tricks on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift in the reflection. I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the mirror, heart hammering in my chest. The reflection was still the same, just the clutter of the attic, the beam of light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But the scratching sound continued, growing louder now, as if something, or someone, was moving behind me. I turned again, but there was still no one in the room. Then, I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. I jerked away, spinning around, but again, there was nothing, just the empty attic and the unsettling sound of the floorboards creaking beneath me. I backed up toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could take another step, the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I tried to pull it open, but the latch wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice sounded muffled as if something was pressing in from all sides. The scratching sound grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, raspy breathing. It was so close, so real, I could feel the air shift around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The creaking, the scratching, the breath, it all vanished, leaving a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move. Eventually, the door creaked open on its own, and I stumbled out of the attic, gasping for air. I didn't stay another night in the house. I packed up my things and left that evening, not caring about the lease I'd signed or the mess I was leaving behind. I've never been back, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out. I don't know what was in that attic. I don't want to know. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear faint scratching at the edges of my consciousness. The abandoned train station. I had been meaning to visit the old train station for weeks. It wasn't a popular spot, not like the bustling city stations. This one was hidden away, forgotten by most, standing at the edge of the town where the tracks no longer ran. I had read about it online, the rumors of its haunting presence, but curiosity got the better of me. I didn't believe in ghost stories, not really, but I couldn't resist exploring. It was a late afternoon when I finally made my way there. The overgrown weeds had all but swallowed the tracks, and the station building itself seemed to crumble with every step I took toward it. The windows were boarded up, the paint was chipped, and the air had an old, musty smell. Despite the isolation, the place felt strangely alive, as if the walls were holding onto forgotten memories. I walked around the outside first, trying to get a feel for the place. The station had a rusted iron gate at the entrance, the kind that hadn't been locked in years, and the wooden bench by the platform was covered in layers of dust. The tracks, too, were abandoned, just a reminder of a time when trains actually stopped here. The silence was unsettling, but it was the kind of silence that made you feel like something, or someone, was always watching. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures of the station's decaying features, trying to capture the atmosphere. As I was snapping a shot of the platform, I noticed something strange. The shadows of the old station seemed to stretch unnaturally long, even though the sun was beginning to set. I dismissed it as my imagination and went inside the building. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floors groaned under each step I took. The waiting room was empty except for a couple of old chairs, their upholstery worn and faded. There were a few broken clocks on the walls, all frozen at different times. The air felt thick, as though the place had been abandoned for decades, and yet there was an odd energy in the room, like the station was holding onto something. I walked through the rooms, taking in the details. The more I explored, the more uncomfortable I felt. I started to hear soft noises, like whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but when I stopped moving, the whispers would stop too. It felt like the voices were coming from somewhere deep inside the building, and they seemed to be drawing me in. The hallway at the back of the station was narrow and dark, and the air felt colder as I made my way down it. The whispers were louder now, almost like they were right next to me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I pressed on, determined to see what I could find. At the very end of the hallway, there was a door that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. It was slightly ajar, and I could feel a cold draft coming from the crack. I hesitated for a moment, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I pushed the door open, I was hit with an overwhelming feeling of dread. The room inside was dark, but there was a faint glow coming from the far corner. As I stepped inside, my flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw someone standing by the window. A figure in tattered clothes, their back turned to me, staring out into the night. I froze. The figure didn't move, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some trick of the light. I called out, my voice trembling, "Hello?" The figure didn't respond, and when I took a step forward, it suddenly vanished. One moment, there was a person standing there, and the next, the corner of the room was empty. I rushed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I passed through the hallway again, I heard the whispers growing louder. I spun around, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. Just the same decaying walls and empty rooms. The station felt like it was alive now, as if it was aware of my presence. The air grew colder with each step I took, and the whispers seemed to be following me. The front door was still open, but it felt like a lifetime away, the distance between me and the exit growing with every step. Just as I reached the door, I heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway behind me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't look back. I just ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing on the overgrown platform, gasping for breath. The whispers were gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been chasing me, something that still lingered within the station. I left the area quickly, my mind racing, but as I walked down the dirt road, I could have sworn I heard the sound of a train whistle in the distance. There were no trains on those tracks. No trains had passed through that station in years. But the sound was unmistakable. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night. The abandoned station was never meant to be a part of my reality. But something about that place, something I can't quite explain, is still with me, following me in the quietest moments. The cracked mirror. I was on my way to visit my sister when I decided to take a detour through the small town I hadn't been to in years. It was a place I had almost forgotten, but something about it called to me. A part of me was curious about how the town had changed. The streets seemed quieter than I remembered, and the air felt thick with nostalgia and something else I couldn't quite place. I parked my car near an old antique shop that had been around for as long as I could remember. The shop was a relic of the past, its windows dusty and cluttered with items no one ever seemed to buy. I hadn't meant to stop, but something about the place pulled me in. The sign hanging above the door creaked in the wind, and I pushed it open, the bell above the door ringing a sharp note. Inside, the shop was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. Shelves were lined with antiques, old books, porcelain figurines, tarnished silverware, and faded paintings. The place was cluttered, but there was a strange sense of order within the chaos, as though everything had its place, even if no one could see it. As I wandered through the aisles, my fingers grazing the items on the shelves, I felt a twinge of unease. It was as though the shop was too still, too quiet. I was about to turn around and leave when something caught my eye, a large, ornate mirror at the back of the shop. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with swirling patterns, and covered in a thick layer of dust. The reflection it offered wasn't just of the shop, though. There was something off about it. When I looked into the glass, I didn't see my own reflection. Instead, there was a shadowy figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart began to race. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. I stepped closer, squinting, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The mirror seemed so normal, just a reflection of the room. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved just out of sight. The shopkeeper, a man with graying hair and thick glasses, approached me from behind, startling me. "You found the old mirror," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "Yeah, it's strange," I replied, still uneasy. "Is it haunted or something?" The shopkeeper chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not haunted. But some say it shows more than just what's in front of it. Some say it reflects things you don't want to see." I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush off the tension that had settled in my chest. "Right, well, I think I'll pass on this one." But something in the back of my mind pushed me to take a closer look. The shopkeeper didn't stop me. In fact, he seemed oddly quiet, as though he were waiting for something. I leaned in closer to the mirror, my reflection finally clear. But again, the shadows behind me seemed to shift, flickering like a dark shape moving just out of sight. I stepped back quickly, my hands trembling. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. I had to get out of there. Without saying another word to the shopkeeper, I hurried toward the door. But as I turned the handle to leave, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the still air. I jumped, startled, and tried to open it again. It wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I shouted, rattling the door handle, but the shopkeeper didn't seem to react. His back was to me, and he was standing by the counter, almost as though he were lost in thought. The silence in the shop was oppressive, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. The reflection in the mirror caught my attention again. This time, I didn't see my own face. Instead, I saw the shadowy figure from before, closer than before, standing in the reflection as if it were right behind me. I turned around. Nothing. I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was still there, its face obscured by darkness, but its presence unmistakable. The longer I stared, the more real it became. I could feel it in my chest, the coldness of its gaze, as if the mirror was somehow pulling me in. I took a step forward, but something stopped me. A voice, low and almost imperceptible, whispered from the direction of the mirror. "You should not have come." I froze. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere around me. It came from the reflection itself, from the shadowy figure. It seemed to move within the glass, slowly shifting toward me. Panic gripped me. I had to get out. I ran for the door again, pounding on the glass, screaming for help. But the shopkeeper didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. Suddenly, the door flew open, and I stumbled outside, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I just ran to my car and drove off, my heart racing, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I've never returned to that shop. In fact, I haven't even passed through that town again. Every now and then, I think I hear that same voice whispering to me from the shadows. But I ignore it because I know better now. There are some things you should never look too closely at. The Unseen Passenger. It was supposed to be a normal night shift, but things never seemed to go as planned. I work as a late-night delivery driver for a small courier service, mostly handling parcels for local businesses that need urgent deliveries. The roads are mostly empty at this hour, which I've always appreciated. I could clear the deliveries in a few hours, and then I'd head back home for some much-needed sleep. That night, though, felt different. The air outside was thick, almost damp, with a light fog rolling in from the outskirts of town. It wasn't unusual to see fog this time of year, but it seemed to settle around the streets in a way that made everything feel more isolated than usual. The city lights reflected off the mist, casting an eerie glow over the pavement. I should have turned back then, but I had a job to do, and the clock was ticking. I had a long list of deliveries that night, and the first stop was a small office building just outside the city center. I parked my van in the parking lot, grabbed the package, and headed inside to make the drop-off. The lobby was quiet, the kind of sterile silence that comes with empty office buildings late at night. I left the package at the reception desk, checked the building for any signs of activity, and made my way back to the van. As I sat in the driver's seat, preparing to head to the next location, I noticed something odd. The van felt off. The air felt heavier inside, as if someone else were in the vehicle with me. I glanced over at the passenger seat, but it was empty, just a pile of paperwork I had yet to sort through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. It wasn't the kind of feeling that makes you jump, it was more like a quiet pressure, a sense that something was about to happen. I chalked it up to the exhaustion from the late hour and the solitude of the job. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and drove off. The fog seemed to get thicker as I headed down the road, obscuring my vision even further. I turned on the headlights, but they barely cut through the dense mist. The streets were quiet, too quiet. I usually passed a few other cars, especially this late at night, but tonight it felt like I was the only one on the road. As I turned onto a quieter street, I heard a soft sound from the passenger seat. It was so faint that I almost thought I imagined it, but there it was again, the sound of breathing. Not the regular, steady rhythm of someone sleeping, but something off, like someone trying to breathe quietly without drawing attention to themselves. I froze, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Slowly, I turned my head toward the passenger seat. The seat was empty. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to convince myself it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind. But as the silence stretched on, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the seat beside me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the sound of the van's engine or the wind. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the sound of breathing kept getting louder and closer. It was like someone was right next to me, their presence impossible to ignore. I risked another glance to the side. The seat was still empty, but this time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a faint outline of something that wasn't quite visible, but it was there. It was almost like a shadow, a dark silhouette, sitting in the passenger seat. My heart raced. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. The fog outside the van had grown so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart and the faint, rhythmic breathing that now seemed to be coming from right beside my ear. I gathered what little courage I had left and looked again. The shadow was still there, sitting unnervingly still. And then, in the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw it. The figure. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me. Cold. Empty. I snapped my head forward, my mind racing, and I quickly put the van back into drive, speeding down the road, desperate to get away. The breathing had stopped, but I didn't dare look back. I knew it was there, watching me, waiting. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep moving, to leave it behind. When I finally reached the next delivery point, I parked the van and sat there, not sure if I was more terrified to get out or to stay inside. But I had to finish my job. I had no choice. As I stepped out of the van, I felt a cold gust of wind rush past me, as if something had moved quickly behind me. I turned around, but the van was empty. The fog had cleared, and everything was eerily quiet once again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, something that never left. I didn't make it to the last delivery of the night. I couldn't. I drove straight home, not stopping until I reached my driveway, and I stayed inside for the rest of the night, not daring to venture out. The next morning, I checked the van. No sign of anyone. No shadow, no breathing, just an ordinary vehicle. But I know what I felt. And I can still hear the sound of that quiet, steady breathing even while I'm alone. The desolate track. It was supposed to be a simple hiking trip. Just a few hours in the woods to clear my head, escape the stress of work, and enjoy some peace and quiet. I wasn't planning on anything unusual happening. The trail was well marked, one I had hiked several times before. I knew the path, the terrain, the landscape. But that day felt different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, as though the forest was holding its breath. I started my hike in the late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the path. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent I had always found comforting. But today, it made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the solitude getting to me. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, birds calling, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. But there was something else in the background. A distant sound, like the faint echo of footsteps, following my every move. It was so quiet at first that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but it kept coming, growing slightly louder with every step I took. I stopped for a moment to listen, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped too. I told myself it was just another hiker on the trail, someone else out here enjoying the day. But when I looked around, the path was empty. The woods stretched on, silent and still. I continued walking, but the sensation of being followed only grew stronger. Every few minutes, I could hear those footsteps, always just behind me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started moving again, they would follow. But when I looked over my shoulder, the path was always empty. By the time I reached the old wooden bridge near the halfway point of the trail, the sky had darkened further. The forest was now a labyrinth of shadows, and I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. The bridge was old, creaking with every step, its planks slick with moisture from the evening dew. I was about to cross when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were ahead, on the bridge itself, growing louder with every passing second. I stood frozen, staring at the dim outline of the bridge. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew someone was on the bridge with me, but I didn't see anyone. I took a cautious step forward, then another. The creaking sound of the wooden planks was deafening in the quiet. As I approached the middle of the bridge, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. I spun around, but once again, no one was there. Then, a cold breeze blew across the bridge, sending a shiver down my spine. I felt it wrap around me, almost as if something invisible was brushing against my skin. I knew I had to get off the bridge, but the feeling of being trapped, the pressure of something unseen, kept me rooted in place. I turned to look down at the creek below, trying to focus on something familiar, but the water was unnaturally still. There was no sound, no movement. It was as if the world had gone silent. Suddenly, the footsteps came again, but this time they were accompanied by a low, guttural sound, a scraping noise, like something dragging across the wooden planks. It wasn't just footsteps anymore, it was something else, something far more unsettling. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I sprinted across the bridge, my heart pounding in my chest, not daring to look back. As I reached the other side, the dragging noise stopped, and the footsteps faded away. I stopped for a moment, gasping for breath, but the woods around me were silent once more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something was following me, just beyond my sight. The rest of the hike was a blur. I moved faster than I ever had before, barely stopping to catch my breath. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, the weight of the woods pressing against my chest. The path seemed endless, the trees growing thicker, the shadows deeper. Every time I looked behind me, the trail was empty, but the sound of footsteps followed me every step of the way. Finally, when I reached the trailhead and saw the parking lot in the distance, I let out a shaky breath. I made it. But as I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. No one behind me. The parking lot was empty, the only sound the rustling of the trees. I got in my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, my hands trembling on the wheel. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trail, just outside the woods. It was a man, or at least, I think it was. He stood motionless, his face obscured by shadow. And though I couldn't see his eyes, I could feel his gaze, cold, empty, unblinking. I didn't look back again as I drove out of the parking lot. I couldn't. I haven't been back to that trail since. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I can still hear the footsteps following me, just out of reach. The echoing call. It was late evening when I decided to take the shortcut home from work. I've always been one for taking the quiet back roads, the ones that wind through the outskirts of town. They're faster, quieter, and always seem to offer a bit of peace after the hectic hours at the office. But that night, something felt wrong. The road was more isolated than usual, with only a few scattered houses far off in the distance. I noticed that even the trees lining the road seemed thicker, their branches twisting into strange, unnatural shapes. It wasn't the kind of scene that's particularly frightening, but it unsettled me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. The air outside was cool, the kind of chill you feel as the night begins to settle. I opened the window slightly, letting in the crisp breeze. The quiet hum of the car engine and the faint rustling of the leaves were the only sounds. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was just past 9. That's when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone calling my name. I couldn't be sure at first. It could have been the wind, or perhaps the faint echo of my own thoughts. But no, it was clearer now. Someone, or something, was calling me. I leaned forward, trying to make out where it was coming from. I looked at the side mirror, then the rear view. Nothing. The road behind me was empty, just a stretch of asphalt and trees disappearing into the dark. The sound, though, was unmistakable. It was my name, but not in any way I recognized. I couldn't pinpoint the source. It felt like it was coming from all around me, but nowhere at the same time. Almost like the trees themselves were whispering my name, urging me to pull over. The call was soft, pleading, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I felt my pulse quicken, but I didn't stop the car. I pushed on. The road ahead twisted into a sharper curve, and as I slowed down to navigate it, I noticed a figure standing just off the shoulder. At first, it was just a silhouette, barely visible in the fading light. But as I passed, my headlights briefly illuminated it. A man, standing completely still, staring into the darkness. He was dressed in an old jacket, and his face was obscured by shadows. My heart skipped a beat. There was something wrong with him. He didn't move at all as the car approached, and for a moment I thought I saw something like a smile forming on his face. But it was fleeting, just a glimpse, and I was past him in a blink. I didn't look back. But then the call came again. My name, louder this time, echoing through the stillness of the night. It seemed to come from all directions, wrapping around me like a blanket. I couldn't tell if it was real or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But every part of me screamed to stop. The sound, the echo, it felt like it was pulling me back, dragging me towards something. I looked in the rearview mirror, and for just a moment, I thought I saw the man again. But he was farther down the road now, standing in the middle of the street, motionless. His head turned toward the car, and I swear I saw his eyes, pale, unblinking, and wide open. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I was too close to home to turn around now. I had to get through this stretch of road. I sped up, pushing the car faster, the engine roaring as I tried to put more distance between myself and whatever was behind me. But the road seemed to stretch on forever. As I passed through the next bend, the trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the light from the stars. The headlights flickered, and for a moment, everything went dark. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for the lights, but before I could reach for them, the headlights flickered back on, illuminating the road in front of me. And then I saw him. The man was standing right in front of my car. barely a foot away. His face was now clear, and the twisted smile I thought I saw earlier was now undeniable, stretched across his face like a grotesque mask. His eyes, cold and empty, locked onto mine. I didn't even think. I floored the accelerator, pushing the car forward, barely missing him. As I sped away, I dared a glance in the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing motionless in the middle of the road, staring at me with that same haunting grin. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't care if I had to go through red lights or drive straight into town. I just needed to get away. The man was still there in the mirror, his face slowly fading into the distance. It wasn't until I pulled into my driveway that I allowed myself to breathe again. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to step outside, to face whatever it was that had been following me. Finally, I mustered the courage to look around. The street was empty. The night was still. I checked the time. It was nearly 10. I'd only been driving for about an hour, but the journey felt like it had lasted much longer. The next day, I took the usual route to work, but when I passed the place where I had seen the man, I couldn't bring myself to look at the spot. It was just another quiet stretch of road now. No sign of anyone. No trace of what had happened. I still take that route to work every day. But every time I pass that spot, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear it, my name echoing through the trees. I didn't want to be at the office that late. Everyone had already left for the night, and the empty hallways echoed with the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. I had stayed behind to finish up a few reports that had piled up over the week, but now that I was done, all I wanted was to get home. But something kept me in my chair, lingering over my computer screen. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like I was waiting for something. The office building was old. It wasn't one of those sleek, modern skyscrapers. It was more like a tired relic of the past, with cracked linoleum floors and outdated furniture. The long, dark corridors were filled with shadows, and the faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, reminding me of the morning rush. The clock on my desk read 11:30. I packed my things slowly, dragging my feet as I moved toward the exit. The building felt unusually quiet tonight, even for after hours. I made my way down the dimly lit hallway toward the elevator. I pressed the button for the ground floor and waited. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside. It was one of those old elevators with metal bars and wooden paneling, the kind that always felt like it could get stuck at any moment. I pressed the button for the first floor. The doors slid shut, and the elevator jerked slightly before starting its descent. I watched the floor numbers change slowly in the dim light. Something about the motion of the elevator made my stomach churn, like I was sinking deeper into something that I couldn't control. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. But then, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the elevator mirror wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just the lighting playing tricks on me, but when I looked closer, I realized that my reflection wasn't moving in sync with me. It was slightly delayed, as if it was a second behind everything I did. I stared at it, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I raised a hand, and my reflection did the same, but a fraction of a second later. I stepped back, pressing myself against the elevator wall, my breath quickening. The reflection seemed to follow me too closely, as if it wasn't my own at all. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My reflection didn't look like me anymore. It looked distorted, its features stretched unnaturally. The eyes in the mirror were wide open, too wide, and the smile that formed across my face wasn't my own. My pulse quickened as the elevator continued its slow descent. I wanted to press the emergency button, but my hands felt frozen to my sides. I tried to look away from the mirror, but my reflection stayed locked on me, its smile growing more sinister by the second. The elevator stopped with a jolt, and the doors creaked open. I was on the ground floor. I stumbled out of the elevator, my legs unsteady beneath me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The hallway outside was still dark, and the door to the exit was just ahead. As I walked toward it, I heard a faint sound behind me, like footsteps, but not mine. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced over my shoulder. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway stretching out behind me. I reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. But then, I felt it again, the sensation of being watched. My gaze darted around, but the street was empty. No cars, no people. Just the quiet hum of the city around me. As I walked down the street, I glanced up at the office building behind me. The windows on the upper floors were dark, but one window on the second floor was glowing faintly. I squinted, but the light seemed to flicker, as though someone was moving inside. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. My reflection. In the dark window of the office, my face was staring back at me. But it wasn't just a reflection. The smile was back, wide and unnerving, and the eyes, they weren't mine. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my breath caught in my throat. And then, the reflection waved. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still watching me. The memory of that smile, the eyes that weren't mine, haunted me for hours. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in that building, something that had followed me out into the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting. The abandoned market. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get home. The train ride was uneventful, just the usual crowd of tired commuters, all silently lost in their thoughts. But when I stepped off the train, I realized something was different. The station was unusually quiet for that time of day. Most people had already left, and the few stragglers seemed to be moving faster, as if in a hurry to get somewhere, anywhere, but here. I walked toward the exit, trying to ignore the strange feeling creeping up my spine. The streets outside were similarly empty. It wasn't too late, only around 8 p.m., but it felt like the city had suddenly emptied out. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, brushing off the unease that lingered. As I walked down the street, I passed by an old market that had been closed for years. It used to be a bustling spot, full of noise and life, but now it sat in disrepair, its windows boarded up, its doors rusted shut. I'd always wondered why no one bothered to renovate it, but tonight it seemed different. A faint light flickered inside, and I noticed that one of the doors was slightly ajar. That was odd. It had been closed tightly the last time I passed by. Curiosity got the best of me. I told myself I'd just take a quick look inside, maybe see what had caused the door to open. I pushed it open slowly, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The air was stale, and the faint scent of mold filled my nose. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way further inside. The market was a maze of empty stalls, their wooden counters long since abandoned. The faded signs above them hung crookedly, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. It was like walking through a ghost town, a place frozen in time. As I walked deeper into the market, I noticed something strange. The light wasn't coming from anywhere in particular, it just seemed to be floating. It was soft, almost like a glow that emanated from the very walls themselves. I took another step forward, my breath growing heavier, as if the air itself was thick with something I couldn't name. And then, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something shifting in the dark. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. My heart began to race. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The market seemed still, but the rustling continued, growing louder with each passing second. It sounded like footsteps. Soft, careful steps, moving in my direction. I froze, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed felt unbearable. My chest tightened, and I instinctively reached for my phone, but the screen flickered before going completely black. Panic surged through me, and I hurriedly shoved it back into my pocket. And then I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting past one of the stalls. It was quick, too quick to be a person. I turned to face it, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just empty space. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the isolation of the market was getting to me. But the rustling started again, louder this time, and closer. It was as if something, or someone, was circling me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and bolted toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the empty market as I ran. But when I reached the door, I froze. It was no longer ajar. The door was completely shut, as if it had never been opened in the first place. My heart raced as I tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me, and I pulled harder, my palms sweating as I struggled to force the door. The rustling was louder now, and I could hear faint whispers, like a dozen voices murmuring in the shadows. My breath quickened, and I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around the darkened market. Then, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to make sense of the pitch-black room. I could feel the air growing colder, and I could have sworn I heard something moving toward me, slow and deliberate. I fumbled for my phone again, but it was still dead. My only source of light was the faint glow from the walls, but it wasn't enough to reveal anything. All I could do was stand there, frozen in fear, as the whispers grew louder and the footsteps drew nearer. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, thin silhouette, its face obscured by shadows. The whispers intensified, almost as if they were urging me toward it. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, my legs refusing to obey. The figure took a step forward, and then another. I could feel its presence closing in on me, its gaze piercing through the dark. It was almost like it was waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know if it was even human. And then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. The market was exactly as it had been before, empty and silent. The figure was gone. The whispers had stopped. I stood there, shaking, unsure if what had just happened was real. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, stayed with me long after I left the market and walked back into the empty streets. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not really. The Forgotten Path. The day had been long, and I was eager to finally get some fresh air. I was walking through a quiet part of the city, away from the usual noise and chaos. The street I turned onto was narrow, lined with old houses that seemed untouched by time. I had walked this path before, countless times, but today it felt different. The air was thick, almost humid, and there was a strange quietness around me. The normal sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, distant voices, seemed muffled, as if they were far away. I kept walking, brushing past the familiar landmarks, an old bookstore, a small cafe, a rusted fire hydrant. But everything seemed to have changed. The old bookstore, usually so inviting, now looked dark, as though its windows hadn't been cleaned in years. The cafe that usually had the smell of fresh coffee brewing now emitted a stale odor, like something was decaying just inside. I shook off the unsettling feeling and decided to take a shortcut through a park I had never visited before. It wasn't on my usual route, but I figured it would be a nice change. I hadn't even realized this park existed until today, and I couldn't understand why I hadn't noticed it earlier. It was tucked between two large buildings, hidden away from the main road. The entrance was a narrow path, overgrown with thick ivy that hung from the old stone gate. As I stepped onto the path, I immediately felt the temperature drop. The air was colder here, and the light was dimmer, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The trees loomed overhead, their leaves rustling gently, though there was no breeze. There was an eerie stillness to the park that made me uneasy, but I pressed on. The path wound deeper into the park, with overgrown hedges and uneven stones beneath my feet. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something wrong about it. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't the normal sense of being observed, it was more like the air around me had thickened, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, following me. I came to a clearing, and there, in the center of it all, stood an old, dilapidated bench. It was odd, considering the park looked so untouched by time. The bench, however, looked ancient, its wood rotting, its iron legs twisted in unnatural shapes. It wasn't something that belonged in this park. It was like it had been left here for a reason, an odd, intentional presence. I approached the bench, almost as if drawn to it. But when I got closer, I noticed something strange etched into the wood. It was barely visible, worn down by years of neglect, but it was there. Letters. Faint, jagged marks that seemed almost like a message. The message read, "Don't sit." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure why, but a sudden urge to leave washed over me. I had to get out of here. I backed away from the bench, but as I turned to leave, I heard it. A soft creaking sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. But when I turned around, the bench was empty. The path ahead remained silent, no sign of anyone or anything. I started walking faster, my heart pounding in my chest, but the footsteps didn't stop. They followed me, just behind, always a step away from mine. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was my imagination, but the sound was too real. My breath quickened, and the further I walked, the faster the footsteps seemed to echo. I looked over my shoulder once more, and this time, I saw something. A figure, barely visible, standing in the distance near the edge of the trees. It was a shadowy form, unmoving. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, standing still, watching me. I broke into a run, my legs aching as I pushed myself harder, the sound of footsteps chasing me. But the more I ran, the longer the path seemed. The park was stretching on, the trees and shadows swallowing up the space in front of me. I could hear my breath growing ragged, but the footsteps never stopped, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, I stumbled. My foot caught on something, and I fell hard onto the cold ground. I scrambled to get up, but the moment I tried to stand, I saw it again, the shadow. Only this time, it was right in front of me, standing just beyond the trees, its face obscured in darkness. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The shadow took a step forward, and the air seemed to crackle with tension. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My chest was tight, my vision blurred, and the only thing I could focus on was the figure. Its presence felt suffocating, overwhelming. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The footsteps stopped, the air cleared, and the park seemed to return to normal. I couldn't understand what had just happened, and I didn't care to try. I ran out of the park, not stopping until I reached the safety of the familiar streets. But even as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, the footsteps, were still with me. I turned down every corner, looking over my shoulder, waiting for it to return. It never did. But I knew that something from that park had followed me, just as it had promised. And I would never go back there again. The sound behind the wall. I had always loved living in this old apartment. The creaking floorboards, the slightly off-center door that was never quite secure, and the strange draft that seemed to come from nowhere, all of it gave the place a kind of character. But recently, something had started to unsettle me. It was a sound, faint at first, but slowly growing louder with each passing day. It began about a week ago, while I was sitting in the living room, reading a book. It was around midnight, and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when everything around you is at rest. Then, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door or lightly tapping a glass. It came from the wall behind my couch, the one that separated my apartment from the one next door. At first, I thought it was the neighbors. Perhaps they were fixing something, or the pipes were making noise again. But then the tapping stopped, just as abruptly as it had started. The silence returned, and I thought nothing more of it. The next night, it happened again. And the next. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something about the sound felt off. It wasn't just the timing, it was the pattern. It wasn't random, it had a rhythm, a deliberate pace that made my skin crawl every time it started. It was almost like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. The tapping continued for several nights. It seemed to come and go, always when the house was at its quietest. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be something as simple as a loose pipe or a rodent trapped in the walls. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of curiosity, I moved the couch away from the wall, listening intently for any sign of the source. Nothing. The tapping stopped the moment I got close, and for a while, the silence was maddening. I waited for a few moments, then decided to knock lightly on the wall, just to see if I could provoke a response. A few seconds passed, and then it came, the soft, unmistakable sound, this time much louder, as if it were closer to me. The tapping came from right behind the wall where I had knocked. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. I stepped back, my mind racing. Was it the neighbors? Could they hear me through the wall? No, that didn't make sense. This tapping wasn't normal. It felt intentional. I felt the cold draft again, and that strange sense of being watched crept over me. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air. The tapping was no longer rhythmic. It was frantic, urgent. A pattern emerged, longer intervals, followed by shorter, rapid taps. And then, nothing. A heavy silence descended. I stood there, staring at the wall, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But when nothing did, I slowly started to retreat, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I turned to leave the room, I heard it. A whisper. "Help me." It was faint, like a voice coming from a far distance, but it was clear enough for me to hear. My blood ran cold. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind or the pipes. There was someone, or something, on the other side of that wall. I backed away slowly, heart pounding, every instinct telling me to get out of the apartment. But I couldn't just leave. I had to know what was going on. My curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed a small hammer from my toolbox and carefully began tapping on the wall, hoping to provoke another response. My hand was shaking as I struck the wall again. This time, the tapping came back faster, more forceful. It was almost like it was angry. And then, just as suddenly, the whisper returned, louder this time. "Let me out." My heart stopped. I couldn't move. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, trapping me in this room. The temperature had dropped again, and the cold was unbearable. The air felt thick, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me from above. I knew I had to act. But before I could even think about what to do next, the apartment door suddenly slammed shut. I whipped around, my breath fogging in the cold air, and saw the doorknob turning on its own. It clicked, but the door didn't open. I was locked in. A feeling of dread washed over me as I turned back to the wall. The tapping had stopped, but the whispering continued, now mingling with something else, low, guttural sounds, like something was scraping the walls from the other side. My head spun, and I knew that I had to get out of there. There was no time to waste. I grabbed my phone, but as I fumbled with it, I noticed something even worse. There was no signal. I was trapped. The air felt heavier, and I could hear the scrape of something moving just behind the walls, closing in, getting closer. I stumbled toward the door again, desperately trying to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I hit it, kicked it, but the door was stuck, locked tight. The whisper came again, right behind me now. "Let me out." Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the wall behind me exploded outward, sending bricks flying. I couldn't even scream. The dust choked me, and in the chaos, I felt something grab my ankle, pulling me toward the jagged hole that had opened in the wall. I fought, kicking and screaming, but whatever it was had a grip on me, pulling me into the darkness behind the wall. I was being dragged, unable to break free. The last thing I remember is the cold, dead silence. And then, nothing. The mirror in the attic. I had always thought the house was perfect. It was old, but charming, just what I had been looking for. My wife and I had found it in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city, tucked away behind overgrown hedges and trees that seemed to conceal it from the world. The attic, however, was something I hadn't noticed when we first toured the house. It was only when I was unpacking that I came across the ladder, hidden behind a dusty bookshelf. I remember thinking it was strange that the previous owners would leave such a useful space untouched, but it didn't matter much. I figured it was just another forgotten corner of the house. That night, after a long day of unpacking boxes, I decided to climb up and explore the attic. It was dim up there, with only a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its flickering light casting strange shadows on the walls. The attic was packed with old furniture, boxes stacked high, a worn-out armchair, and a few pieces of antique-looking furniture covered in dusty sheets. But there was something else in the corner, something I hadn't noticed before. A mirror. It was large, framed in tarnished gold, and it stood against the wall like it had been placed there intentionally. I couldn't understand why anyone would leave such a thing behind. The mirror looked out of place in the cluttered attic. It didn't match anything in the room, and it was almost too pristine, too perfect for such a dusty, forgotten space. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to approach it. As I stood before the mirror, I couldn't help but notice how clear my reflection was. It was almost unsettling. Everything around me seemed to blur, as if the mirror was trying to isolate me from the rest of the world. I stared at myself, studying the lines of my face, the tiredness in my eyes, when something caught my attention in the reflection. Behind me, something moved. I whipped around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty, dusty attic. The stillness returned, and I tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled over me. But when I turned back to the mirror, the reflection was different. It wasn't me standing there anymore. The figure in the mirror was a man, tall, with hollow eyes and a thin, gaunt face. He was staring directly at me, his lips barely moving, but I could hear him whispering. The sound was faint at first, just a low murmur, but as I leaned in closer, I could make out the words. Leave. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. But the strange figure didn't stop. He stepped forward in the reflection, his movements jerky and unnatural, and reached his hand out, as if trying to touch the glass. I recoiled, heart pounding, but the hand didn't disappear. It stayed there, pressing against the mirror. Leave, the voice repeated, louder this time. It's not your house. I stepped back, terrified, and the man in the mirror followed my movements, his cold eyes never leaving mine. My breath quickened, and I turned to run back down the ladder, but before I could move, the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The whispering grew louder, echoing off the walls. I could hear the man now, his voice becoming more desperate, more insistent. Leave. You shouldn't be here. I will make you leave. The attic felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me. The air grew thick, and I could almost feel the presence of something else in the room with me, something dark, something ancient. My heart raced, and my hands shook as I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The mirror, the man in the mirror, it was pulling me in. I could see him reaching out now, his fingers inching closer to the glass. His hand pressed harder, and suddenly, I felt a sharp, cold pain in my chest, as if his fingers were pushing through the mirror, through the glass, and into me. I gasped, stumbling backward, and the pain grew worse, as if the mirror was sucking the life out of me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed, frozen in place, unable to look away from the mirror. The man's face twisted into a grin, an expression of pure malice, as he stepped closer to the glass. And then, with a violent, gut-wrenching crack, the mirror shattered. I don't remember much after that. My mind went blank. The last thing I recall was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. Then, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my bedroom, lying in my bed, drenched in sweat. The house was silent, and the morning light filtered through the curtains. I sat up, heart racing, trying to shake off the nightmare. But then, as I looked around the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mirror was there. It was hanging on the wall in the exact same spot where it had been in the attic. The glass was intact, and its surface was impossibly smooth, reflecting everything around it as if it had never been shattered. I could see my reflection. But this time, I wasn't alone. The man was there, standing just behind me, his hollow eyes watching me. His mouth moved again, but this time there was no whisper. Just a smile. The last bus. It was late, later than I should have been out, and I was standing at the bus stop, tapping my foot impatiently. The city was quiet, and the streets were nearly empty except for the occasional car whizzing by. I had just finished an exhausting day at work and was eager to get home, but the bus was taking forever. It wasn't just the lateness of the hour that made me uneasy. There was something about the stop that felt off, like the shadows were too long and the air too still. The fluorescent streetlight overhead buzzed intermittently, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked pavement, but even that seemed insufficient to drive away the dark stretch of night beyond. When I checked the time again, I realized I had missed the last bus by over 15 minutes. At least, that's what I thought. I double-checked my phone, but the schedule confirmed it. It was strange. I'd never seen the schedule run this late before. As I stood there, shivering slightly in the evening chill, I heard the sound of a bus's engine approaching in the distance. I looked down the empty road, hoping it was the bus I'd been waiting for. But it wasn't. It was another, older bus, one I hadn't seen before. It rumbled down the street, its headlights gleaming like pale eyes in the dark. The bus slowed as it approached the stop, its brakes hissing loudly as it came to a halt right in front of me. The doors creaked open, and I hesitated for a moment. The driver, a man wearing a long, dark coat, leaned forward with a forced smile, his eyes too bright in the dim light. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice scratchy and hollow, like it came from some long-forgotten place. I stared at him for a moment. The bus looked older than anything I had seen in the city, the kind of bus you'd see in a museum or a horror film. The windows were grimy, and the interior lights flickered, casting strange, irregular shadows on the seats inside. There were no passengers, just empty rows of seats staring back at me. I wasn't sure why, but I found myself nodding. I didn't want to wait for another bus, and something about the man's smile made me want to get out of the cold. I climbed aboard, and as soon as I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, and the engine roared back to life. The air inside was thick and musty, and the seats, though old, were oddly comfortable. The bus pulled away from the stop, and I glanced out the window, half expecting to see the streetlights fade behind me as we drove deeper into the city. But there was no city anymore. The road outside the window had changed. Instead of the familiar streets and buildings, there was only darkness, stretching endlessly in all directions. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and there were no signs of life, no cars, no people, no buildings. Just endless, suffocating blackness. I turned back to the driver, who was still staring ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His smile was gone now, replaced with an expression I couldn't quite read. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask him what was going on, but no words came out. The silence in the bus was suffocating. I sat back in my seat, my heart pounding, my thoughts racing. What had just happened? Why had the world outside changed? Was I dreaming? I pinched myself, trying to wake up, but the sharp pain only reminded me that I was fully awake. The bus began to pick up speed, and the dark landscape outside seemed to blur, the shadows growing thicker, pressing closer to the windows. I was beginning to feel dizzy, like I was falling into the very night around me. That's when I noticed it. There was something moving outside, something that didn't belong. A figure, tall, hunched, and shrouded in darkness, was walking along the side of the road, its long limbs swinging in erratic motions. The figure didn't seem to notice the bus as it passed, but I couldn't look away. It was as if the figure's gaze was fixed on me, even though it had no face, only darkness where its eyes should have been. I pressed my hands against the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure was already gone, lost in the blackness. That's when I heard it. A voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable, whispered from the back of the bus. "You shouldn't have gotten on." I spun around, heart racing. There was no one there. The seats were empty, save for the one beside me, which was now occupied by something I couldn't quite see, though I felt its presence. It wasn't human. It was more like a shadow, dark, formless, and cold. I felt a chill creep up my spine as it shifted beside me, its presence heavy in the air. Who's there?" I stammered, my voice shaking. But the silence was deafening. I looked at the driver, but he didn't respond. He didn't even seem to notice the growing presence beside me. The bus continued its journey through the black void, with no sign of stopping. A low, guttural laugh echoed from somewhere behind me, and I froze. It was getting closer. I felt the temperature drop sharply, my breath turning visible in the air as a cold, unnatural wind filled the bus. My heart was pounding in my ears as I turned back toward the door, but there was nothing I could do. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the bus came to a stop. I looked outside, but the darkness was gone. The familiar city streets were back. The bus had somehow returned to the same bus stop where I had boarded. But there was something different now. Everything felt off. The buildings, the cars, the people, they were all wrong, slightly out of focus, as if they weren't entirely real. I stumbled out of the bus, my legs weak, and turned around to see the bus pulling away. But before it disappeared into the night, I saw the driver's face one last time. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was just watching me, his eyes empty, like a hollow shell. And the bus? It didn't leave. It stayed there, waiting. The sound of silence. I had always loved the quiet of the countryside. It was my escape from the constant noise of the city, just a small, peaceful cottage tucked between the trees, with nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets to disturb the stillness. This weekend was supposed to be another of those peaceful escapes, away from the emails and constant buzz of urban life. I arrived just before sunset, the last rays of the day casting a warm, golden glow over the fields. The cottage was as I remembered, simple, old, with creaky wooden floors and a fireplace that always made the place feel cozy. I unpacked quickly, set up a few things in the kitchen, and then poured myself a cup of tea, settling down with a book by the window. The evening passed peacefully. The wind picked up, making the trees sway outside, and the darkness fell over the landscape. The house was silent, and I relished that silence. But as I sat there, flipping through the pages of my book, I began to notice something strange. The sound of the wind, the usual quiet hum of the forest, seemed to have faded. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. After all, the night was still young, and sometimes the wind died down when it got colder. But as the minutes passed, the silence grew deeper, unnervingly deep. It was as if everything had stopped. No wind, no rustling of the leaves, not even the distant sound of animals in the forest. I tried to shake it off, but the silence felt unnatural. It pressed on my ears, thick and suffocating. I couldn't hear anything outside the cottage, nothing at all. Even the usual creaks of the house settled into an eerie stillness. I tried to play some music to break the tension, but the volume seemed to fade into the silence as though it was being swallowed by the air itself. I stood up and went to the window, opening it to see if maybe a breeze had picked up outside. But the night was still. Not a single leaf moved in the trees. I could see nothing in the moonlight except the long shadows stretching across the lawn. Then I heard it. A soft tapping, like a knuckle lightly tapping against wood. I turned quickly, looking around the room. It was coming from upstairs. My heart rate quickened, but I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling. It had always made strange noises, especially at night. But then it happened again. The tapping, louder this time, accompanied by a faint, rasping sound, like someone was dragging their nails across the floor. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The silence had been so complete, so thick, that the sound felt like it was magnified 1,000 times. My mind raced. Was someone in the house? But I was alone. I had been alone the entire time. My phone was upstairs, charging, and I realized I hadn't heard it ring once. No notifications, no calls, just silence. The tapping continued, slower now, almost deliberate. I could feel the cold air in the room deepening, like it was seeping through the walls. My eyes darted to the staircase, my body frozen, too afraid to move. And then, something shifted, just a subtle change in the air. I could feel it. I slowly, cautiously made my way to the bottom of the stairs, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. The air around me was thick, heavy, like the room was holding its breath. Each step I took seemed to echo louder than the last, the silence swallowing every sound. The closer I got to the top of the stairs, the more the tapping intensified. It was coming from the attic now, the sound echoing through the hollow space above me. Something was in there. I reached the door to the attic and hesitated. The handle felt cold under my hand, and I slowly turned it, pushing the door open just a crack. The stale, musty air from the attic flooded the room. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and I could barely make out the silhouette of someone, standing in the far corner. A figure, hunched over, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was watching me, waiting. My heart was pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. The air around me felt thick, oppressive. "Hello?" My voice cracked, barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its head tilted at an angle, like it was listening for something. The silence between us grew unbearable, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then, suddenly, I heard the faintest sound, almost like a whisper, but it wasn't from the figure. It was coming from behind me, from downstairs. A voice, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "Don't turn around." My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't coming from anyone in the attic. It wasn't coming from the figure either. It was as though the silence itself had spoken. I slowly backed away from the attic door, my eyes never leaving the figure. But as I turned to flee, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My legs were stiff with fear, my pulse racing, but I couldn't move fast enough. I had to get out of there. I ran to the door, threw it open, and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran through the dark, the grass cold and wet beneath my feet, until I reached the road. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind racing. What had happened? Was the figure in the attic real, or had I imagined it? I glanced back at the cottage, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something in the window, something moving, watching. And then, nothing. No figure. No voice. Just the overwhelming silence. The Forgotten Passenger. The bus ride from the city to the small town where my aunt lived was always uneventful, a routine I'd grown used to over the years. I'd been visiting her for a few days, helping her sort out some things around the house, and now I was headed back to the city. It was late, almost midnight, and the bus was half empty, just a few scattered passengers along with me. The bus itself was old, one of those models with the brown vinyl seats and faint, worn-out smell of old leather. It creaked and rattled over the uneven road, the headlights illuminating the road ahead, casting long shadows on the side of the bus. The rhythmic motion of the wheels beneath me, coupled with the quiet hum of the engine, made it easy to drift off. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting my mind wander. When I opened my eyes again, the bus had stopped at an old, run-down bus station. The overhead lights flickered, casting an eerie glow over the empty platform. It was a small stop, the kind where no one ever gets off. There were no signs of life except the dim light and the occasional rustle of the wind. I looked around. The bus driver had gotten out, probably for a quick break, but there was no rush. I glanced at the other passengers. There was an elderly woman sitting across from me, her eyes half closed as if in deep thought. A man in a black jacket sat near the front, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, his posture stiff and unyielding. I let out a sigh, glancing out of the window. The town seemed so quiet, almost too quiet. I glanced down the platform, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the distance. A person, wearing a tattered coat, standing at the very edge of the platform. I couldn't make out their face, but something about the way they stood unnerved me. It wasn't until the bus doors suddenly opened, breaking my concentration, that I snapped back to reality. I turned to look at the driver, who had re-entered the vehicle. He gave me a brief glance before pulling the doors shut and getting back to his seat. As the bus lurched back to life and started moving, I saw the figure again, standing in the same spot, just watching the bus leave. It was odd. In all the years I've been taking this route, I had never seen anyone get on or off at that station, especially this late at night. I shook the thought from my mind and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The bus was quieter now. The passengers around me were all still, their faces blank. The old woman was staring out the window, but her eyes were unfocused, as though she was lost in some distant memory. The man with the black jacket hadn't moved at all. And then, without warning, the bus hit a bump in the road. I jerked forward slightly, startled, but what caught my attention was the faint sound of a cough from behind me. It wasn't like the usual cough you might expect. It was dry, almost unnatural. I turned around, scanning the bus. At first, I didn't see anyone unusual, just the same few passengers. But then, I noticed something. The empty seat next to me, the one I had been sitting in when I boarded, was now occupied. There was a figure sitting there, hunched over slightly, their face obscured by a hood. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't seen anyone board the bus at the last stop. No one had moved in the seat across from me, and yet there it was, someone sitting right next to me. I tried to turn my gaze away, pretending I hadn't noticed, but a cold chill crawled up my spine. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just sat there, still and silent, like a shadow that didn't belong. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Are you okay?" There was no response, but the figure shifted slightly, turning their head just enough for me to see a pair of dark eyes staring back at me from beneath the hood. The eyes were wide, almost too wide, and there was something unsettling about them, something I couldn't quite place. The silence hung thick in the air as I stared at those eyes. I could feel my heart racing, a tightness in my chest. I tried to look away, but my gaze was drawn to them, like some force beyond my control was making me watch. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure turned its head away. The eyes disappeared beneath the hood, and it seemed to settle back into its previous position. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my nerves. The bus was still moving, the familiar motion of the wheels beneath us continuing. The headlights sliced through the night, casting long shadows that danced across the road ahead. But there was something wrong. I glanced back at the other passengers. The elderly woman, the man in the black jacket, they were all still. No one had moved, no one had spoken. A few more minutes passed, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me. I glanced down the aisle, and that's when I saw it. The man in the black jacket was standing. But he wasn't walking. He was standing still, right in the middle of the aisle, his back turned to me. He was perfectly still, like a statue. Then, without warning, he turned around. His face was no longer hidden beneath the brim of his hat. I could see his face now, pale, gaunt, with dark bags under his eyes. His lips curled into a faint smile. "Are you lost?" he whispered. His voice was low, almost too quiet to hear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the bus lurched again, this time much more violently. The lights flickered, casting everything into brief darkness. The sound of the engine sputtered, and the bus seemed to slow down. The next thing I knew, the bus was empty. There were no passengers. No driver. No sounds except the hum of the engine. I was the only one left, sitting in the dark, with nothing but the cold silence surrounding me. The windows were black, the road was gone, and all I could hear was my own breathing. I grabbed my bag, my hand trembling, but the doors wouldn't open. I tried every button, every lever. Nothing worked. The windows wouldn't budge either. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered again, "You're not going anywhere." The Library of Echoes. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys quiet evenings spent at the local library. It's a habit I've had for years, ever since I moved to the city for work. The library is an old building, nothing too extraordinary, but there's something calming about its vast collection of books and the soft murmurs of pages turning. It's my escape from the noise of the world. That evening, I had planned to study for an upcoming presentation, but when I arrived, the place seemed eerily quiet. It was later than usual, almost closing time, but the door was still unlocked. I thought nothing of it. The staff sometimes let people stay late if they're working on something important. I walked through the long, narrow corridor lined with tall bookshelves. The usual ambient noise of hushed voices and the rustling of pages was absent. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard, a dull background that barely cut through the silence. I headed toward my usual corner, a small, secluded area near the back. The lighting here was dim, with only a few desk lamps illuminating the tables. As I set my bag down, I noticed a slight flicker from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the lights malfunctioning, but then I realized there was something moving in the shadows between the shelves. I froze, not out of fear, but curiosity. Was it someone else in the library, or just my mind playing tricks? I waited for a moment, but the movement stopped. I told myself it was nothing. People often come and go in the late hours. Still, a strange unease settled in my chest as I opened my laptop and started to work. Minutes passed. The silence in the library had deepened, becoming almost oppressive. And then, the same flicker of movement appeared again, this time closer. I felt my heart rate quicken as I looked over my shoulder. No one was there. Just the empty rows of books, their spines cold and unread. My eyes darted across the room, and that's when I saw it, a figure barely visible between two shelves. It wasn't a person, though. It was more like a shadow, something that couldn't quite be placed in the natural world. I stood up, my mind racing. The air felt heavier now, like the walls of the library were closing in. I approached the figure slowly, my footsteps muted against the thick carpet. The closer I got, the more distorted the shape seemed. It was like a smear against the edges of reality, something out of place. I stopped a few feet away. The shadow didn't move. I held my breath, unsure whether to speak, to call for help, or to run. But then, to my horror, the figure moved. It didn't step forward, it didn't shift in the usual way. Instead, it glided toward me, a slithering motion that didn't make sense. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. The air around me grew colder. The figure was now much closer, its form shifting, like it was trying to take shape. It was taller than a person, thin and dark, with elongated limbs that stretched unnaturally. But there were no details, just a black mass with indistinct edges. I turned and bolted back toward the front of the library. My mind raced. Was I dreaming? Was this some kind of hallucination? As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me. The figure was no longer in the aisle I had just left, but I could hear faint whispers, like 1,000 voices murmuring at once, all calling my name. The sound echoed through the empty shelves, growing louder and louder with each passing second. I reached the main exit, my hands trembling as I pushed on the door. But it wouldn't open. I tugged harder, panic setting in as I pulled on the handle, but the door was locked. How was that possible? It had been open when I entered. I could hear the whispers now, closer, almost like they were right behind me. The air felt thick, pressing against my chest. I turned around. The shadowy figure was there again, much closer this time. It seemed to be moving toward me in quick, fluid motions, closing the gap between us faster than I could react. My heart raced, and I hammered on the door, yelling for help, but the library was empty. No one was around to hear me. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. The figure was mere feet away, and its shape was becoming clearer now, too clear, too real. I could almost see its eyes, dark and hollow, staring directly at me. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out completely. The entire library was plunged into darkness. My breathing was the only sound in the vast emptiness. And then, there was a voice, so close that I could feel the chill of it against my skin. "You shouldn't have come." The door behind me unlocked with a loud click. I didn't hesitate. I ran, not looking back, just running through the dark hallways, feeling the cold air brush against me. The whispering followed me, fading just as quickly as the light flickered back to life. I burst out into the street, panting and disoriented. The library door slammed shut behind me, and when I looked back, everything was still. There was no sign of the figure, no whispering voices, just the quiet hum of the city. I didn't go back inside. And I never will. The Forgotten Bridge. I had always been a fan of hiking, and on this particular day, I was looking for a new trail to explore. After browsing a few websites, I found a mention of an old bridge deep in the woods, one that hadn't been in use for years. The description piqued my curiosity. It was hidden from most hikers, and few people even knew of its existence. That was exactly the kind of adventure I was looking for. I drove to a nearby town and parked at the trailhead. The path ahead looked untouched, like it hadn't seen much foot traffic in ages. There was a faint trail, but nothing too defined. I grabbed my backpack and set off, the dense forest surrounding me on all sides. The trees were tall and thick, their shadows casting eerie patterns on the forest floor. It was a quiet day, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. The deeper I ventured, the more I realized how isolated this place truly was. My phone had no signal, and the only sounds were those of nature. It was both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. But my mind was set. I was going to find the bridge. After about an hour of walking, I came to a clearing, and there it was. The bridge. It stood there, half decayed, with vines creeping up its sides. It was made of old wood, the planks cracked and warped with age, yet it still stood proudly over a small, slow-moving creek. I could tell it had been abandoned for a long time, the wood darkened by weathering and time. I crossed the bridge carefully, taking in the view of the creek below. The water was shallow, the rocks scattered across the creek, and everything around me seemed frozen in time. But as I reached the middle of the bridge, something caught my attention. A soft creaking noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the wood settling under my weight. But then, I heard something else, footsteps. I froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the crunch of leaves, twigs breaking underfoot. Someone, or something, was out there, in the woods, moving toward the bridge. My heart began to race. I looked around, but the woods were silent. No movement. No one in sight. I called out, but my voice felt small, lost in the vastness of the forest. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. No response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and yet there was no one in sight. I looked back at the bridge, the air feeling heavier now, as if it was closing in around me. I stepped off the bridge and onto the path, trying to keep calm. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the trees. It was tall, shadowed, and for a moment, I couldn't make out any details. But then, it stepped closer into the light, and I saw it clearly. It was a man, dressed in old, tattered clothing. His face was pale, almost sickly, with deep, hollow eyes that stared at me with an intensity that made me shiver. But the most unsettling thing was his movement, slow and deliberate, as though he was studying me, waiting for me to make the next move. I felt a cold chill wash over me as I stood frozen in place. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in the ground, unable to move. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But when I finally found the strength to move, I couldn't help but glance back. The figure was still there, following my every step with those cold, unblinking eyes. I began to walk faster, my breath shallow, until I found the courage to break into a jog. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees too thick to see beyond. I kept running, branches scratching at my arms, until I reached the edge of the woods where the path met the clearing again. The figure was gone. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran the rest of the way back to my car, constantly checking over my shoulder, expecting to see that pale face watching me from the trees. When I got to the parking lot, I glanced at the entrance of the trail. The woods stood still, peaceful again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from within, something I had disturbed by crossing that bridge. I drove home without looking back, my heart still pounding in my chest. That bridge, that figure, it didn't belong to the world I knew. And I had no intention of going back to find out what it truly was. The vanishing train. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I had to catch the late train from the station to visit a friend in the next town. The weather was damp and foggy, the kind of misty evening that always made the world feel quieter, more distant. I'd made the usual trip many times before, nothing extraordinary about it. But that evening, something would change. I arrived at the station with 10 minutes to spare. The platform was nearly empty except for a few scattered commuters, all huddled against the chill in their coats. The distant rumble of a train echoed through the air as I made my way to the bench. I checked the departure board. The train to my destination was running on time, scheduled to leave in about 5 minutes. Nothing out of the ordinary. The station was old, its walls lined with faded advertisements for things that didn't seem to exist anymore. The trains themselves had a certain old-world charm, with metal sides and ornate detailing on the doors. It was the kind of place you'd expect to find in an old movie, one that had barely changed in years. But as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The platform, the station, everything felt wrong. It wasn't the kind of unease you get when you're scared. No, it was deeper than that, a nagging feeling that you just couldn't explain. I shook my head, trying to ignore it. Perhaps it was the fog or the quietness of the evening. I focused on my phone, tapping through social media to distract myself. Then, I heard it. A train whistle, sharp and sudden. I looked up, startled. It wasn't the normal sound of an approaching train. This was different, almost distorted, as if the sound was coming from further away than it should have. The lights flickered overhead, and I glanced up at the departure board again. The train to my destination was now listed as delayed, but the board didn't say for how long. I stood up, walking toward the edge of the platform. No one else seemed to be reacting. The few commuters remained seated, seemingly unaware of the change in the atmosphere. A low rumbling vibrated through the ground, and I saw the train's headlights emerge from the fog. It wasn't the one I was expecting. The train was different, older, with an eerie, withered exterior that looked almost like it had been pulled from another era. Its windows were cracked, the edges of the metal frame rusted and worn. But what really caught my attention was the sound of the train. It was moving slower than normal, almost as if it were dragging itself along the tracks. The fog seemed to part as it approached, but only in a strange, unnatural way, as though the mist itself was retreating, unwilling to touch the train. The train came to a stop in front of me. The doors slid open with a mechanical groan. No one else had moved. The platform was still nearly empty, and no one was boarding. I glanced at the sign above the door. It read the same as always, but something about it looked off. Like the letters were slightly misaligned, as if they had been hastily painted over. Without thinking, I stepped forward. The door slid shut behind me with a sharp click, and the train lurched forward immediately. I froze in place, my heart beginning to pound in my chest. I hadn't even seen anyone else board. No conductor. No passengers. The inside of the train was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the tracks below. The air smelled stale, and I noticed a thick layer of dust covering the windows. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. No bars. Just that endless, empty screen. I didn't understand. This wasn't the right train, and yet I was on it, moving further into the fog. The station was behind me now, lost in the mist, and I had no idea where I was headed. The train jolted as it picked up speed, and I grabbed onto the nearest pole to steady myself. The lights flickered once more, casting long, eerie shadows along the narrow aisles. The silence was deafening. It was as though the world had ceased to exist beyond this train. I looked around the car, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the darkness. He didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, and for a moment, I thought about getting off at the next stop, but I knew that wouldn't help. The train didn't feel like it was heading to any station. It was simply moving through endless blackness. The figure stepped closer, and my pulse quickened. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to move. The man was just a few feet away now, his face still hidden in shadow. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand where I was, but my voice wouldn't come. It was as if the train had swallowed every sound, every possibility. The man moved again, and this time he raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. A gesture that sent a wave of icy dread through me. Suddenly, the train lurched again, and I was thrown off balance, stumbling backward. The figure was gone. But in that same moment, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The windows, there were no longer any lights outside. No city, no passing scenery. Just blackness. The train wasn't moving forward. It was lost. And I was trapped. I couldn't tell you how much time passed. The doors remained closed. The figure never reappeared. But when the train finally came to a stop, the doors opened on their own. I didn't look back as I stumbled off, desperate to leave, desperate to escape whatever nightmare this was. When I reached the platform, I was greeted by a different station. Not the one I had boarded from, not even close. The signs were faded, the platform deserted. And when I looked at the departure board, I saw that my train wasn't listed at all. The Whispering Wall. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small one-bedroom on the second floor of an old brick building. It was one of those places that looked perfectly fine during the day but felt slightly off once the sun set. The hallways were dimly lit, the walls had that creaky, worn-down feel, and the paint had chipped in several spots. But it was cheap, and after a long day of unpacking, I was more than happy to settle in. It was around 9 in the evening when I first noticed it. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while a low, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. At first, I thought it was just the house settling or maybe the hum of the old refrigerator. But as the sound persisted, I realized it was something else. Something more deliberate. It was a whisper. I stood up and moved closer to the wall where the sound seemed to be coming from. At first, I couldn't make out any words, just the faint rustling of voices, soft, like a murmur between two people. The wall was thin, but it didn't seem like I had any neighbors on the other side. The apartment had been empty when I moved in, and the place next door had a for rent sign still hanging out front. Still, the whispering persisted. I pressed my ear to the wall, feeling the coolness of the plaster against my skin. The murmur was faint but definitely there. A faint, rhythmic pattern, as if someone was trying to tell a secret. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. It was unsettling. I pulled away from the wall and walked over to the window, trying to shake the eerie feeling. But as I gazed out into the street below, something else caught my attention. It was the same sound, the whispering, except this time it felt louder. I glanced around the room, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The air seemed to be heavier, thicker, as if the room itself was breathing. I checked the kitchen, then the bathroom, and even the closet. There was nothing. The apartment was empty, just me and the whispering. It was getting harder to ignore. I walked back to the wall and pressed my ear against it once more, this time listening intently. The sound became clearer. I could make out words now, though they were distorted, like a voice traveling through water. Get out, get out, get out. The message was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat and panic surged in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. The apartment felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few minutes. I quickly backed away from the wall, my breath shallow and fast. This wasn't just some weird noise. It was a warning. But from whom? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I jumped, startled by the sound that seemed to cut through the thick silence of the room. I hesitated for a moment before moving toward the door. My hand gripped the knob, and with a deep breath, I opened it. There was no one there. Just the empty hallway. I looked both ways, expecting someone to jump out at me, but it was silent. The lights flickered briefly, and the walls seemed to close in around me. A few seconds later, I closed the door and locked it, my hand shaking as I did. I tried to reason with myself. There was probably some logical explanation. Maybe it was the pipes, the building settling, or some kind of old electrical glitch. Anything to make sense of what had just happened. But as I turned around, there it was again. The whisper. I froze. This time, it was louder and clearer, like the voice was right next to me. Leave. Now. I turned and looked at the wall again, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather and stretch unnaturally. The whispering was building, almost as if it were getting closer. There was a pressure in the air, an overwhelming sense of something pressing on me from all sides. I ran for the door. I couldn't stay here anymore. But as I reached for the handle, the apartment lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. Panic took over. I fumbled around for my phone, using its dim flashlight to navigate through the dark. But as I stepped back toward the door, I froze. The walls were moving. Not in any obvious way, no shifting or collapsing, but they were undulating, like the very structure of the room was alive, breathing with me. The whispering had grown louder, more urgent, like someone was speaking directly into my ear. Get out. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. There was only the sound of that whisper, the strange undulating of the walls, and the icy grip of fear around my chest. Without thinking, I bolted from the apartment, leaving everything behind. I didn't even grab my coat. I didn't look back. As I stood on the street, gasping for air, I realized something chilling. The whispering hadn't stopped. It was still there, distant but unmistakable. Somewhere, deep within the walls, something was waiting for me to return. The forgotten message. The evening had been like any other, quiet, calm, almost comforting in its predictability. I had just finished a long day at work, and as usual, I stopped by the coffee shop near my apartment. The scent of freshly brewed espresso and the murmur of quiet conversations filled the air as I made my way to the counter. It was a place I often went to unwind, to gather my thoughts after the stress of the office. I grabbed my usual, a cappuccino, extra foam, and took a seat by the window, watching the rain fall outside. I loved this feeling of being tucked away from the world, a cup of warm coffee in hand, the outside world a blur of wet streets and passing cars. But tonight, there was a strange undercurrent in the air. I couldn't quite place it, but something felt off. I tried to push the feeling aside as I opened my laptop and began checking emails. But then, something caught my eye, a message. It was from an unknown number, and there was no subject. I hesitated for a moment before clicking on it, curious. The message was short, just one sentence. You don't know what's coming. I stared at it for a moment, confused. Who would send something like that? I quickly dismissed it as a prank or some sort of spam, but the strange feeling in my chest wouldn't go away. I scrolled through my other emails, hoping to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the thought of that message. It felt personal, like someone had been watching me. I tried to ignore it, but the unease lingered. I left the coffee shop and walked back to my apartment, the rain now pouring harder, the streets reflecting the dim lights of the city. As I entered my building, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just the weather or the late hour, it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I made my way up to the third floor, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall. When I reached my door, I noticed something strange. There was a small piece of paper wedged under it. I bent down and picked it up. It was folded neatly, and when I unfolded it, I saw a single sentence written in hurried, blocky handwriting. It's too late to leave now. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same message from before. The same words. But this time, it felt different, more real, more urgent. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly unlocked the door and stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, but something about the silence felt suffocating, like the space itself was holding its breath. I double-checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. There was no reason to be afraid, I told myself. But the anxiety gnawed at me, deep in my gut, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I sat down at my desk, trying to focus on something, anything, but the words from the message kept replaying in my mind. It's too late to leave now. What did it mean? Who was behind this? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just then, my phone buzzed. Another message, this time from the same unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, my hand trembling slightly as I unlocked the screen. The message was short and to the point. "We're closer than you think." My blood ran cold. I looked around the room, suddenly aware of every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I was alone. I had to be. But then, something moved out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting across the room. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Just the empty apartment. My phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from my security app. The camera outside my apartment door had detected motion. I froze, staring at the screen, my breath shallow. The camera feed opened, showing the hallway outside my door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Yet, the notification said the motion had been detected. How was that possible? I checked the time. It was nearly midnight. The building was supposed to be empty by now. I heard a soft click from the hallway, followed by a faint scuffling sound. It was as if someone was standing just outside my door. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. The sound stopped abruptly, and there was nothing but silence. I reached for the handle and twisted it slowly, holding my breath. The door opened, but no one was there. I stepped into the hallway, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. The corridor was empty, just as the camera feed had shown. But as I moved farther down, I noticed something unsettling. The faint smell of perfume lingered in the air, a sweet, sickly sweet scent I didn't recognize. It was as if someone had been there just moments ago, but I was alone. I turned back toward my apartment, my mind racing. What was happening? Who was doing this? Why? As I stepped back inside, I felt it again, the sudden sensation of being watched. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, crawling up my spine. The whispering, like a soft breeze, brushed against my ear. It's already begun. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, the click of the deadbolt loud in the silence. I backed away, my chest heaving with panic. The walls seemed to close in, the apartment suddenly feeling smaller, tighter, as if it were no longer mine. The lights flickered, and I saw something in the corner of my movement. A shadow, dark and unblinking, stood at the edge of the hallway, just beyond the glow of the lamp. I ran for the window, but the blinds were already closed. The familiar hum of the city outside had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. And then, my phone buzzed once more. You can't escape it. I looked at the screen, my fingers shaking. The unknown number had sent one final message. It's waiting for you. And with that, the room went dark. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.